The man they called the Butcher of the Northern Campaign stood alone in the marble corridor while every lord and lady in the kingdom pretended he didn't exist. Duke Ronan Valacrest of Blackthorne Keep had learned years ago that isolation was simply another form of power, and tonight, surrounded by champagne-drunk aristocrats who feared him more than they feared God, he'd never felt more in control. But power, like everything else worth having, demanded a price. And somewhere in the rain-soaked streets below the palace, a woman was running for her life with documents that would destroy half the men in this room. What Ronan didn't know yet was that before the night ended, she'd throw herself into his world and detonate every carefully constructed wall he'd built between himself and the concept of caring about another human being. Stay with me. This is where possession becomes the only language left when love has been beaten out of you by war and survival, and the cold understanding that weakness kills faster than any blade. The ballroom of the imperial palace glittered like a diamond mine had exploded across 3 stories of architectural excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from gilded ceilings, throwing fractured light across marble floors polished to mirror shine. 600 of Ashenmere's finest predators moved through the space in silk and velvet, their smiles sharp as knives, their laughter calculated to the decimal point of political advantage. The Winter Sovereign Ball was where power came to preen and where fortunes died in whispered conversations behind painted fans. Ronan stood near the eastern colonnade, a glass of untouched wine in one hand, watching the performance with the detached interest of a man who'd seen too many bodies to find theater impressive anymore. He was 34 and looked like something carved from stone by an artist who'd forgotten how to do gentle. 6'3" of controlled violence in a black suit tailored within an inch of perfection, dark hair cropped military short, a jaw that could cut glass. His eyes were the color of winter storms, and they moved across the crowd with the efficiency of someone cataloging threats before they could materialize. A cluster of young nobles noticed him looking and immediately found somewhere else to be. Good. Duchess Seraphine Valacrest materialized at his elbow like smoke given human form. His aunt was 63 and more dangerous than half the assassins in the kingdom, her silver hair pinned into an elaborate construction that probably cost more than a farmer earned in 5 years. She wore midnight blue silk and a smile that would make a shark nervous. "You're projecting menace again," she said, her voice pitched low enough that only Ronan could hear. The Marchioness of Greyhold just fainted when you looked in her general direction. I wasn't looking at her. You were looking near her. For these people, that's sufficient cause for cardiac distress. Seraphine's eyes swept the ballroom with the same tactical assessment Ronan had been performing. When are you going to stop punishing yourself for surviving the war by making everyone else wish they hadn't survived your homecoming? Ronan took a slow breath. The northern campaigns ended 3 years ago, but he still woke up most mornings expecting to find frost on dead faces and blood turning black in the snow. 60,000 men had marched north under his command. 23,000 came back. The mathematics of leadership, written in corpses. I'm here. I'm wearing the suit. I'm performing the required social ritual. What more do you want? Seraphine studied him with the kind of look that had been dissecting Valacrest heirs for 4 decades. I want you to stop treating existence like it's something to be endured until you're finally killed properly. Before Ronan could respond, before he could find words for the hollow feeling that lived where optimism used to, a commotion erupted near the palace's northern entrance. Raised voices, the sharp crack of someone shouting orders, then the unmistakable sound of boots on marble, moving fast. Every conversation in the ballroom stuttered and died. Ronan's hand moved automatically to where his sword would be if he were in armor instead of evening wear. Old habits. The kind that kept you alive when civilization was just a thin coat of paint over the same violence that had always run the world. Through the massive gilded doors burst 3 armed men in the livery of Lord Cassian Vexley, and behind them stumbled a woman who looked like she'd fought her way through hell to get here. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair plastered to her face by rain, dressed in a servant's simple gray dress, now torn and muddy. Blood ran from a cut above her left eye. She moved with the desperate energy of prey that had run out of places to hide. The guards were closing in when she did something Ronan had never seen in 20 years of navigating aristocratic society. She grabbed a champagne flute from a passing server, hurled it at the loud guard's face hard enough to shatter bone and glass together, then threw herself directly at Duchess Seraphine like a drowning woman grabbing for a rope. Please. The word came out ragged, half prayer and half demand. I have evidence. Lord Vexley murdered a girl named Catherine Ashford 2 nights ago because she found his smuggling ledgers. I have the documents. I have proof. But if you don't help me right now, I'm dead. And so is any chance of justice for her or the 30 other people he's killed to keep his operation quiet. The ballroom had gone silent with the kind of absolute quiet that only comes when 600 people stop breathing at the same time. Seraphine's expression didn't change. She looked at the woman like she was examining an interesting chess problem. Then she looked at the guards, who had frozen 3 feet away because nobody with functional survival instincts got within striking distance of a Valicrest without permission. Ronan moved without thinking. 2 steps put him between the woman and the guards. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't raise his voice, just stood there. And the entire geometry of the situation rearranged itself around the fact of his presence. The lead guard, a thick-necked brute with a broken nose, courtesy of the champagne flute, tried to hold his ground. My Lord Duke, this woman is a thief and a liar. Lord Vexley has demanded her immediate return to answer for crimes against his household. Ronan let 3 seconds of silence stretch out until they became uncomfortable. Then 5. Then 10. He'd learned in the war that sometimes the absence of response was more terrifying than violence. What's your name? He asked the woman without looking away from the guard. Lyra. Her voice was steady despite everything, which was either courage or shock. Lyra Everwyn. My father was Aldrich Everwyn. The royal investigator, Lord Vexley, had murdered 6 years ago for getting too close to his operation. I've been working in his household for 8 months, copying everything. And now he knows. So he's going to kill me exactly the same way he killed my father, unless someone with enough power decides they care about the law more than they care about not offending a parliamentary lord. Seraphine made a small, interested sound. Everwyn. I remember that case. They said he was killed by rebels. They lied, Lyra said. I was 16. I watched my father's body pulled from the river with his throat cut, and I spent 8 years planning how to prove what happened. The documents are in my dress. Smuggling manifests, payroll records for hired killers, correspondence with 6 different parliamentary lords about dividing up territories and tax revenue. Catherine died because she saw one of those letters. She died because she was in the wrong hallway at the wrong time. And Lord Vexley decided murder was easier than explanation. The guard tried again. My Lord Duke, Lord Vexley is a member of Parliament and— Get out! Ronan's voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made it infinitely worse than shouting. My lord, we have orders. You have 3 seconds to leave this room before I have you arrested for threatening a woman under Valicrest protection. 1. The guards looked at each other, looked at the woman, made the catastrophic mistake of thinking this was a negotiation. 2. My lord, if you would just listen. Ronan moved. He covered the distance in less than a second, caught the lead guard by his collar, and lifted him half off his feet with one hand. The man outweighed him by 30 pounds, and Ronan held him like he was made of straw. When he spoke again, every person in the ballroom heard him clearly. If I reach 3, you'll learn exactly why they called me the Butcher up north. The men who gave me that name are still having nightmares. You want to join them? He dropped the guard. The 3 men practically fell over each other getting to the exit. The ballroom remained frozen. Ronan turned back to Lyra and found her staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. Not fear, exactly. Something harder. Something that looked like recognition. Seraphine was already moving, her mind clearly 6 moves ahead. We need to see those documents. If what you're saying is true, we'll need corroboration, testimony, and a very expensive lawyer. If you're lying, you've just committed suicide by Valicrest, which I suppose is creative, if nothing else. She glanced at Ronan. We should move this conversation somewhere less public before Vexley rallies half the parliament to descend on us with lawyers and probable assassination attempts. Ronan looked at Lyra properly for the first time. She was still bleeding, still soaked from the rain, standing in the middle of the most important social event of the year, looking like a drowned cat with a death wish. But her eyes were clear, focused. She wasn't here begging, she was here negotiating. Why us? He asked. You could have gone to the Crown investigators, the royal magistrate, any number of because they're all on Vexley's payroll or too scared to cross him. Lyra cut him off with the kind of blunt honesty that would get most people killed in aristocratic circles. My father tried the official channels. He tried the law. He tried honor and evidence and all the pretty lies they teach you about justice. And they put him in the river for it. So I did my research. I found out which noble house in this kingdom has enough power to tell Vexley to go to hell, and enough of a reputation for not caring about consequences that he might actually believe the threat. The Valicrests don't negotiate. You don't play politics. You're the only family in Ashenmere that operates on violence and fear instead of favors and blackmail. She looked directly at Ronan. And you're the man who held the northern lines for 2 years by convincing an entire army that you'd rather die than retreat. I'm betting you'll do the same thing to protect evidence that could tear down half the corrupt infrastructure in Parliament. Seraphine laughed. It was not a comforting sound. Oh, I like her. She's either brilliantly strategic or completely insane. Possibly both. Ronan studied Lyra with the same assessment he'd give to a new recruit. She was gambling everything on his reputation, banking on the image of the butcher. The problem was, she wasn't wrong. Vexley was exactly the kind of parasite that had gotten good men killed while politicians argued about jurisdiction and propriety. And if the evidence was real, this was the kind of fight that could finally do something about the rot. But it was also political suicide. Vexley had connections. He had parliamentary immunity. He had enough blackmail material on other lords to trigger a cascade of retaliation if anyone moved against him directly. Taking this on wasn't just dangerous. It was guaranteed disaster for anyone involved. Ronan looked at Seraphine. His aunt's face was carefully neutral, which meant she was already calculating angles and outcomes. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Seraphine's smile was the kind sharks got before feeding time. "I'm thinking that our family has spent 3 years trying to figure out how to root out the smuggling networks that are bleeding tax revenue and flooding the streets with weapons. I'm thinking that Lord Vexley has been untouchable because he's very good at making sure every investigation dies before it reaches his name. And I'm thinking that a witness with documentary evidence could be exactly the opening we need to start dismantling the infrastructure that makes men like him possible." She paused. "I'm also thinking that protecting this young woman is going to require resources, legal protection, and probably a small private army because Vexley is not going to simply accept defeat. So the question is whether you're ready for that particular war." Ronan looked back at Lyra. She was watching him with the intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the next 30 seconds. No fear in those eyes. Just cold determination and the kind of exhaustion that came from running too long on pure will. He'd seen that look before. In the mirrors after battle. In the faces of soldiers who'd survived when they shouldn't have. In himself, every morning when he woke up and remembered he was still alive while better men weren't. "Come with us," he said. "We'll review your evidence. If it checks out, I'll see you protected. But understand this clearly. The moment you step under Valicrest protection, you become our responsibility. That means following orders. That means accepting security protocols. That means your life stops being entirely yours because we can't protect you if you decide to improvise." Lyra's laugh was short and bitter. "My life stopped being mine when my father's body came back from the river. I've been dead already for 6 years. I'm just trying to make it mean something before they finish the job." "Fair enough." Ronan gestured toward a side exit that would take them away from the ballroom and toward Blackthorne Keep's private quarters. "Then let's go figure out if your evidence is worth starting a war over." They moved through the corridors of the palace with Seraphine leading, Ronan bringing up the rear, and Lyra between them like cargo that might explode. Nobles scattered out of their path. Servants found urgent business elsewhere. The Valicrest reputation was doing what it did best, clearing obstacles through pure intimidation. But Ronan's mind was already 6 moves ahead, cataloging the problems. Vexley wouldn't let this go. The man had too much to lose. He'd come with everything: legal pressure, parliamentary allies, probably hired killers if the situation got desperate enough, which meant Blackthorne Keep was about to become a fortress under siege. Again, always. The thought settled over him with the familiar weight of inevitability. This was what he did: hold positions, protect objectives, survive longer than the enemy's will to attack. The specifics changed, but the fundamental reality never did. You picked a line, and you defended it until something broke. Usually him. They reached the private study Seraphine maintained in the palace's west wing. She dismissed the guards, locked the door, and pulled curtains across windows that overlooked the rain-soaked city. Then she turned to Lyra with the kind of focus a surgeon uses before cutting into something vital. "Show me." Lyra reached into her dress. the kind of hiding place that probably would have gotten her killed if the guards had been competent, and pulled out a leather folder wrapped in oilcloth. She laid it on the desk and opened it with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline crash. The documents inside were meticulous. Ledgers showing smuggling payments cross-referenced with dates and shipments. Letters written in careful political language that still managed to discuss murder and territory division without ever quite admitting to crimes. Personnel records listing hired enforcers and their assignments. A whole architecture of corruption laid out in ink and paper. Seraphine read with the speed of someone who'd spent 40 years navigating political warfare. Her expression didn't change, but Ronan knew her well enough to see the calculations happening behind her eyes. This wasn't just evidence. This was a loaded weapon aimed at the heart of Parliament's most protected networks. "This is real," Seraphine said finally. "This is detailed, corroborated, and absolutely damning for at least 15 major political figures. If we release this publicly, we'll trigger a parliamentary crisis that could destabilize the entire government." She looked at Lyra. "You weren't exaggerating. Vexley will kill you rather than let this see daylight. The question is whether we have the resources to keep you alive long enough to testify." "That's where it gets complicated," Lyra said. She pulled out another sheet, this one clearly written in her own hand. "These are the people I trust. It's a very short list. Most of them are already dead. The ones who aren't dead are either compromised or scared enough that they won't help, which means if you want me alive for trial, you need to put me somewhere Vexley can't reach, somewhere he wouldn't dare try." She looked directly at Ronan. "Somewhere under protection so absolute that coming after me means going to war with a force he can't defeat." Seraphine saw where this was going before Ronan did. Her smile was the expression of a chess player discovering the opponent had blundered into checkmate 3 moves ago. "You want Blackthorne Keep?" she said. "You want to become untouchable by becoming Valicrest property. I want to stay alive long enough to watch Vexley burn," Lyra corrected. "If that means putting myself under the protection of the most terrifying family in the kingdom, then yes, that's exactly what I'm asking for." Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest. He knew what was coming, could see it forming in Seraphine's mind like a storm gathering on the horizon. "There's only one form of protection that absolute," his aunt said slowly. "Only one relationship that would give you total legal immunity and make any attack against you a direct assault on the Valicrest bloodline itself." She turned to Ronan. "She needs to marry into the family. And since I'm already widowed and you're conveniently unmarried, I think we both know which option makes more strategic sense." The silence that followed was the kind that comes right before explosions. Ronan stared at his aunt, then at Lyra, then back at Seraphine like she'd just suggested he solve a diplomatic crisis by setting himself on fire. Absolutely not. "It's practical," Seraphine continued as if he hadn't spoken. "Marriage creates legal protections that nothing else matches. As your wife, she'd have Valicrest immunity, Valicrest resources, and Valicrest security. Vexley couldn't touch her without effectively declaring war on our entire house." She paused. "And it solves your problem, too." "I don't have a problem. You're 34 and haven't been in the same room with a woman socially since you came back from the north. Parliament is starting to ask questions about succession. This kills both birds with one extremely convenient stone. I'm not marrying a stranger to solve your political puzzles." Seraphine's expression hardened into something that reminded Ronan exactly why people were more afraid of her than most armed men. "You'll marry her because it's the smart tactical move, and because you know I'm right. You'll marry her because we need this evidence and she needs protection, and this is how we accomplish both objectives. And you'll marry her because deep down you know that letting Vexley win, because you were too stubborn to compromise, would be the kind of failure that keeps you awake worse than the war does." Ronan turned to Lyra. She was watching the argument with an expression he couldn't read. Not hopeful, exactly. More like someone watching a trial where the verdict would decide whether she lived or died. "And you?" he asked. "You're actually willing to chain yourself to someone you don't know for the sake of revenge?" Lyra's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure my father's murder wasn't meaningless and Catherine's death isn't forgotten. If that means marrying the butcher of the northern campaigns and living in a fortress that feels like a prison, then yes. Absolutely. Without hesitation." She met his eyes without flinching. "And let's be clear, I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking for romance or partnership or any of the pretty lies people tell themselves about marriage. I'm asking for protection, for legal immunity, for enough power that when I stand up in front of Parliament and tear Vexley's life apart, He can't simply have me killed like he did everyone else who tried. That's the transaction. You give me survival. I give you the evidence to destroy a corruption network that's been bleeding the kingdom for years. She wasn't wrong. Ronan hated that she wasn't wrong. This was exactly the kind of cold strategic calculation he'd been trained to make in war. Evaluate objectives, assess resources, choose the path that accomplished the mission even if it cost everything else. He'd spent 3 years holding positions he didn't want to hold, giving orders he didn't want to give, surviving outcomes he should have died in. This was just another tactical decision dressed up in ceremony and legal paperwork, except it wasn't, because marriage was permanent, because this woman would become part of his life in ways that couldn't be undone, because somewhere in all the strategic calculation, there was a human being asking him to save her life, and he'd already failed to save too many. The exhaustion hit him all at once. The weight of every decision, every compromise, every time he'd chosen survival over everything else. He was so tired of living like the world was one long battle where the only victory was still being alive when morning came. Fine, he said. The word came out flat. Final. We'll do it your way. Marriage, legal protection, whatever bureaucratic nightmare this turns into. But understand something clearly. This is a contract, a transaction. You get Valicrest protection and I get your evidence. Nothing else changes. We live separate lives under the same roof. You stay alive long enough to testify. Then we figure out what comes after. Lyra nodded once. That works. Seraphine looked between them with an expression that was either satisfaction or concern. It's settled then. I'll draw up the contracts tonight. We'll need witnesses, legal documentation, and… The door exploded inward. Not shattered. Not kicked. Exploded, as if someone had used a battering ram specifically designed for architectural demolition. 3 men poured through the opening, armed with short swords and moving with the ugly efficiency of professional killers who'd done this before. Ronan moved on pure instinct. He caught the nearest attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisted hard enough to feel bones separate, and used the man's momentum to drive him face first into the marble floor. The second attacker came in low. Ronan caught him with an elbow to the temple that dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. The third man made it past Ronan's guard. He went straight for Lyra with a knife that looked designed for gutting rather than stabbing. She tried to dodge, but she was exhausted, hurt, and trapped between furniture and violence. The blade was 2 inches from her throat when Ronan caught the assassin's arm and broke it in 3 places without slowing down. The man screamed. Ronan threw him into the wall hard enough to crack plaster and bone simultaneously. Silence crashed back into the room like a physical force. Seraphine was standing behind her desk with a small pistol that had materialized from somewhere in her dress. Lyra was pressed against the bookshelf, breathing hard, eyes wide with shock and something else. Something that looked like she'd just watched her entire understanding of violence get recalibrated. Ronan stood in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 unconscious bodies, and breathing like he'd just finished a light exercise rather than dismantling 3 trained killers in under 30 seconds. So much for Vexley waiting to see how the negotiation played out. Seraphine lowered the pistol. She didn't look surprised, just resigned to the fact that tonight had officially become the kind of disaster that would dominate gossip for years. We need to move. Now. He'll send more. Better ones. Ronan grabbed Lyra's arm, not rough, but not gentle either, and pulled her toward the destroyed door. Blackthorne Keep. Tonight. We're not safe anywhere else. What about the contracts? Lyra asked. We'll figure out the paperwork after we survive the immediate assassination attempts. Ronan was already moving, dragging her with him, while Seraphine followed with the kind of calm that came from spending decades in situations exactly this dangerous. Right now, survival is the only contract that matters. They ran, through corridors, down servant stairways, out into the rain-soaked night where carriages waited in neat rows like soldiers at attention. Ronan's personal transport was black lacquered steel, reinforced with the kind of defensive modifications that turned a carriage into a mobile fortress. He threw Lyra inside with less ceremony than cargo, climbed in after her, and barked orders to the driver before the door even closed. Go! Fast! And if anyone tries to stop us, don't. The carriage lurched forward hard enough to throw them both against the seats. Lyra was staring at him with the kind of intensity that came from realizing your entire future had just changed shape in the span of 5 minutes. You just agreed to marry me. Ronan looked out the window at the city passing in rain-blurred shapes. I just agreed to keep you alive long enough to destroy the man who killed your father. Don't confuse utility with sentiment. I'm not. Her voice was steady despite everything. I'm just clarifying expectations. You want a contract. I want survival. We both get what we need. That's fine. But you should know something about me before we do this. Ronan turned to look at her properly. What? I don't break. I don't quit. And I don't forget. Lyra's eyes were dark and hard and full of something that looked like fury refined into absolute determination. You're marrying someone who has spent 6 years planning revenge, who watched her father die and decided she'd rather burn the whole kingdom down than let it stay corrupt. So if you think I'm going to be a quiet, decorative wife who smiles at parties and stays out of your way, you're going to be disappointed. I came here for war. Just because it's wearing legal documents instead of swords doesn't change what it is. Good, Ronan said, because Blackthorne Keep doesn't have room for people who break under pressure. You want to survive? You want to fight? Then understand that the moment we reach my fortress, you stop being the victim and start being a weapon. I'll teach you how to defend yourself, how to think tactically, how to survive in a world where weakness is lethal and mercy is a fantasy people tell themselves before they die. You want war? I'll give you war, but you follow my orders, you trust my judgment, and you don't second-guess tactical decisions in the middle of combat. Deal. They shook hands like soldiers forming an alliance before battle. The carriage raced through Ashenmere's rain-soaked streets toward the northern cliffs, where Blackthorne Keep rose like a monument to violence and survival. And somewhere behind them, Lord Vexley was learning that he'd made the catastrophic mistake of attacking a woman under Valicrest protection. The war had already started. Ronan just hoped they'd both survive what came next. Masem? Blackthorne Keep materialized out of the storm like something carved from nightmares in medieval warfare. Built directly into the northern cliffs, the fortress was less architecture and more calculated intimidation rendered in stone and iron. 4 massive towers crowned with battlements that had seen actual siege combat, walls thick enough to laugh at cannon fire, a gate that looked like it could stop an army. The carriage rolled through that gate and into a courtyard lit by torches that turned rain into curtains of liquid fire. Servants appeared from nowhere, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd been trained to respond to crisis without questions. Ronan was out of the carriage before it fully stopped, barking orders in the kind of tone that turned suggestions into law. Lock down the fortress. Full security protocols. Nobody enters without my personal authorization. Deploy the guard rotation I designed for siege conditions. And someone get the physician to the east wing immediately. A woman who looked like she'd been carved from the same stone as the keep itself stepped forward. She was 50-something with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. This was Marin Blackwood, head of household and the closest thing Ronan had to family, besides Seraphine. My lord, we heard what happened at the palace. Marin's eyes tracked to Lyra with professional assessment. Is this her? Ronan nodded. Lyra Everwin. She'll be staying with us indefinitely. Full security, private quarters. And she needs medical attention for that head wound. Staying with us, Marin repeated. Not visiting, not recovering. Staying. She's going to be my wife. Marin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been surprise if she weren't too professional to show it. I see. Should I prepare the Duchess' quarters? Yes. Ronan was already moving toward the keep's interior. And have the armory opened. She needs to learn how to defend herself, and we're starting tonight. My lord, the girl looks half dead already. Perhaps Vexley sends another assassination team before morning, and she dies because we prioritized rest over preparation. Ronan's voice was flat. I've seen what happens to people who aren't ready when violence arrives. I'm not watching it happen again. He didn't wait for a response. Just walked into the keep's vast entrance hall with Lyra trailing behind him, like she'd been swept up by a hurricane and hadn't yet figured out where she'd landed. Blackthorne Keep's interior was everything the exterior promised, and worse. High ceilings that swallowed light, stone walls decorated with weapons instead of art, furniture built for function over comfort. It felt less like a home and more like a military command center that someone had grudgingly made inhabitable. Lyra was staring around like she'd just stepped into a different world. She probably had. This is where you live? This is where we live now. Ronan led her through corridors that twisted through the keep's interior like a defensive maze. Your quarters are in the east wing. Private entrance, reinforced door. Windows that don't open more than 3 inches because I had them modified after the war. You'll have guards posted outside, but they answer to me, not you. So I'm a prisoner. You're protected. Ronan stopped in front of a heavy oak door banded with iron. There's a difference. Prisoners don't get access to the full resources of the Valacrest Intelligence Network, legal team, and private military. You do. But protection requires accepting limitations on freedom. That's not negotiable. He opened the door. The quarters beyond were surprisingly spacious. Not luxurious exactly, but comfortable in the way military officers' quarters were comfortable. Everything you needed, nothing you didn't. A large bed with heavy curtains that could be drawn for privacy. A writing desk positioned near windows that overlooked the cliffs. Bookshelves already stocked. A private bathing room. And everywhere, the sense that this space had been designed by someone who understood that comfort was a luxury you earned by surviving long enough to need it. Lyra walked in slowly, taking in details with the kind of careful observation that suggested she was cataloging exits and potential defenses without conscious thought. Smart. She paused. This is better than anywhere I've lived in 6 years. It's adequate. Ronan stayed in the doorway, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. The physician will be here in 10 minutes. After that, we go to the armory. You need to understand how to use a weapon before you need to use a weapon. Lyra turned to face him. The exhaustion was starting to show now, settling into her features like something heavy. Why are you doing this? Doing what? This. All of it. You could have turned me away at the palace, told Vexley's guards to take me, avoided the entire political disaster. But instead you're here, turning your fortress into my personal protection detail and planning weapons training like I'm a recruit instead of a bride. Why? Ronan considered the question. Considered lying. Considered giving her the tactical answer about evidence and political advantage and strategic necessity. Told her the truth instead. Because I've spent 3 years watching people die because no one with power decided to do something about it. He met her eyes. Because weakness in the face of corruption is just another form of murder. And because you walked into that ballroom covered in blood and rain and asked for war instead of mercy. That takes a kind of courage that most nobles have forgotten exists. So I'm doing this because you earned it. And because maybe, just maybe, keeping you alive is the first actually useful thing I've done since I came back from the north. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Then Lyra smiled. It was small, tired, real. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Ronan turned to leave. We haven't survived tomorrow. He closed the door and stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against stone and wondering what the hell he'd just agreed to. Marriage. Protection. War against one of Parliament's most powerful lords. Just another day of choosing violence over peace, because peace was a luxury for people who hadn't learned yet that survival was the only virtue that actually mattered. He headed for his own quarters, with the familiar weight of responsibility settling over his shoulders, like armor he could never quite take off. Behind him, the fortress locked itself down for siege. And in the city below, Lord Vexley was learning that he'd just made an enemy of the one man in Ashenmere who had forgotten how to lose. The armory occupied the entire north tower of Blackthorne Keep. 3 floors of weapons arranged with museum precision. Swords from campaigns going back 2 centuries, rifles that had seen action in every major war, specialized equipment designed for everything from assassinations to siege warfare. It smelled like steel and oil and history written in violence. Ronan stood in the center of the main floor, watching Lyra move through the space with the kind of careful attention someone gives a dangerous animal they're trying not to provoke. The physician had cleaned and stitched the cut above her eye, pronounced her miraculously free of serious injury, and suggested rest with the tone of someone who knew the suggestion would be ignored. Have you ever held a weapon before? Ronan asked. Kitchen knives. A letter opener once when Lord Vexley's guard got too aggressive. Lyra touched a sword hanging on the wall but didn't pick it up. Nothing like this. Then we start with basics. Ronan selected a short blade from a rack, something between a long knife and a short sword. This is better for close quarters than the battlefield weapons. Easier to hide. Easier to use in confined spaces. And since your primary threat is assassination rather than open warfare, this is what you need to know. He handed it to her. She took it with the awkward grip of someone who'd never held anything designed specifically for killing. Not like that. Ronan moved behind her, adjusting her grip without asking permission. Your thumb goes here. Fingers like this. The power comes from your core, not your arm. You're trying to penetrate armor or flesh, not impress anyone with dramatic flourishes. His hands were larger than hers, scarred and calloused from years of violence. Hers were smaller, softer, but she didn't flinch when he touched her. Just adjusted her position and focused on the lesson with the intensity of someone who knew her life depended on remembering every detail. Now show me, Ronan said, stepping back. Lyra moved through a basic strike. It was clumsy, unbalanced, but she committed to it without hesitation. Again. She did it again. Better this time. Ronan spent the next 2 hours teaching her how to kill someone. Not theory, not philosophy. Practical mechanics, where to aim for maximum damage, how to compensate for size disadvantage, what to do when someone grabs you from behind. He taught her the way he'd learned in the military, repetition until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Lyra was a quick study. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't waste energy on uncertainty, just absorbed the information and practiced until her arms shook from exhaustion. When she finally collapsed against the wall, breathing hard, Ronan allowed himself a small nod of approval. You're better than I expected. Low bar, considering you expected a completely helpless victim. I expected someone who'd spent their life avoiding violence, not seeking it out. Ronan hung the practice blade back on its rack. You've been planning this for 6 years. That takes commitment most soldiers never develop. Lyra slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, head tipped back, eyes closed. What happened up north? The question came out of nowhere. Ronan felt his entire body tense like she'd just stepped on a tripwire. What? She opened her eyes and looked at him directly. Everyone knows the Butcher of the Northern campaigns came back different. That you held impossible positions and won battles that should have killed everyone involved. But nobody talks about what actually happened. What changed you? Ronan was quiet for a long time, long enough that most people would have withdrawn the question. Lyra just waited. Finally, he spoke. I made decisions that kept more people alive than any alternative would have. But the mathematics of command means every decision that saves 100 kills 10, or 20, or in one particular case, 3,000. He looked at the weapons surrounding them. I came back because I was good at choosing who died, better than anyone else. And that's not a skill you forget how to use. It's a skill that rewrites how you think until you can't stop seeing the world as a series of tactical problems to be solved through controlled violence. Is that what I am? A tactical problem? Yes. Ronan met her eyes. You're evidence that needs protecting, an asset that has strategic value, a person who becomes exponentially more useful alive than dead. That's how I'm thinking about this, how I have to think about it. Because the alternative is caring whether you survive for reasons that have nothing to do with utility, and I stopped being able to afford that kind of thinking somewhere around the third mass grave. The silence that followed was the kind that hurts. Then Lyra stood up, walked over to him, and did something completely unexpected. She put her hand on his arm. Not aggressive, not seductive. Just human contact from someone who understood exactly what he'd just said. Good, she said quietly, because I need someone who thinks tactically, who understands that survival matters more than sentiment. I don't need rescue. I need an alliance with someone who knows how to win wars. So if you're looking at me and seeing a military objective to be accomplished, that's perfect. Because I'm looking at you and seeing the weapon I need to destroy Lord Vexley. Ronan stared at her hand on his arm like it was some kind of puzzle he couldn't solve. Then, very carefully, he stepped back. You should rest. Tomorrow starts the legal proceedings. Seraphine will have the marriage contracts ready and will need to file them before Vexley can mount a parliamentary challenge. Lyra nodded, withdrew her hand, didn't look hurt by the distance, just accepted it as another tactical parameter. One more question, she said as he turned to leave. What? Do you regret it? Agreeing to this? Ronan paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the torchlight from the corridor beyond. Ask me again when we're both still alive. He left her there in the armory surrounded by weapons and history and walked back through corridors that felt too empty now that he'd committed to filling them with someone else's presence. Myrn was waiting in his study with the kind of expression that meant she had opinions and was going to share them whether he wanted to hear them or not. You're really going through with this? It was not a question. I gave my word, Ronan said, to a woman you met 3 hours ago, to protect her from a parliamentary lord who has more connections than sense and enough money to hire every assassin in the kingdom. She paused. This is madness. This is tactical necessity. This is you finding another battlefield because you can't figure out how to exist when you're not at war. Marin's voice was sharp. I've known you since you were 12 years old. I watched you leave for the campaigns a soldier and come back something else. And now you're marrying a stranger because it gives you permission to fight again. Maybe. Ronan sank into his chair. Or maybe I'm just trying to do something useful before I lose what's left of whatever made me human in the first place. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed to his desk and poured 2 glasses of whiskey from the decanter he kept for nights, when sleep seemed impossible. She pushed one toward him. She's stronger than she looks, Marin said. That girl. Lyra. I saw her in the courtyard. Most people would have collapsed after tonight. She's standing up, asking questions, planning next moves. That's not trauma response. That's survival instinct. Good. Ronan drank. She's going to need it. So are you. Because this isn't just protecting evidence, boy. This is bringing another person into your life when you've spent 3 years making sure nobody gets close enough to matter. That's going to change things whether you plan for it or not. Nothing changes. This is a transaction with clear parameters. She survives. I get the evidence. We coexist under the same roof until the threat is neutralized. Then we negotiate whatever comes next. Marin's smile was sad. You keep telling yourself that. Maybe by the time the wedding happens, you'll even believe it. She left him alone with his whiskey and his thoughts, and the growing certainty that he'd just made a decision that would reshape everything he'd carefully constructed to keep himself functional after the war. Outside, the storm was getting worse. Rain hammered against stone. Wind howled through battlements designed to withstand siege weapons, but apparently not weather. And somewhere in the East Wing, Lyra was learning to sleep in a fortress that felt like a prison disguised as protection. Ronan stared at the tactical maps spread across his desk, Ashenmere's parliamentary districts, Vexley's known properties, potential vulnerabilities in his security network, and began planning the war that would start the moment the marriage was official. He was good at war, better than he was at peace, better than he'd ever been at anything resembling normal human existence. So maybe Marin was right. Maybe this was just him finding another battlefield because he'd forgotten how to exist when he wasn't fighting. But if that was true, then at least he'd chosen a fight worth having. Ronan raised his glass toward the empty room in a silent toast to the woman sleeping 1 floor above him, and to the disaster they were about to unleash together. Then he went back to planning how to keep them both alive long enough to see it through. The storm had turned Blackthorne Keep into something that sounded like the end of the world was being negotiated outside the walls. Ronan woke at dawn out of habit, not necessity, his body refusing to accept that the war had ended years ago. The maps on his desk looked exactly like he'd left them. Vexley's empire spread across parliamentary districts like a cancer with clean borders. He'd barely slept. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the reason, spending 3 hours planning how to keep one specific person alive instead of the usual nightmare inventory of everyone he'd failed to save up north. The difference bothered him more than he wanted to examine. Marin knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. She carried a tray with coffee strong enough to strip paint and news that looked worse. Lord Vexley filed an emergency parliamentary motion at first light. He's claiming Miss Everwyn is a thief who stole confidential documents and is demanding her immediate return to face criminal charges. She set the tray down with the kind of careful control that meant she was furious. He's also requesting a formal inquiry into whether you coerced her into seeking Valicrest protection under duress. Smart. Ronan drank the coffee black and scalding. He's reframing the narrative before we can control it, making her the criminal and me the aggressor. What's the parliamentary response? Split down predictable lines. Vexley's allies are calling for your censure. Your enemies are calling for investigation. Your friends are notably silent because nobody wants to get caught in the crossfire. She paused. Duchess Seraphine is already at the palace making counter-arguments, but this is going to get ugly fast. It was always going to get ugly. Ronan stood and moved to the window overlooking the courtyard, where guards were running morning drills with the precision of soldiers who understood that sloppy technique got you killed. The question is whether we move fast enough to make Vexley's narrative irrelevant by presenting evidence so damning that nobody cares about theft accusations. The marriage contracts arrived an hour ago. Marin's tone suggested she had opinions about the speed of that development. Duchess Seraphine wants you to sign them today and file before Vexley can get a judicial order blocking the union. Then we sign today. And Miss Everwin? Does she know you're planning to marry her in approximately 6 hours? She knows what she agreed to. Ronan turned from the window. Send someone to wake her. We need to review the evidence together before the lawyers arrive. And have the kitchen prepare something substantial. If we're going to war with Parliament, I'd prefer to do it without anyone collapsing from hunger. Marin left with the expression of someone who'd worked for the Valcrest family long enough to recognize disaster in progress, but not long enough to stop caring about the casualties. Ronan dressed in the kind of formal attire that turned him from soldier into aristocrat. Black coat cut to emphasize shoulders earned through combat, silver buttons bearing the Valcrest crest, boots polished to a mirror shine. The costume of power. He'd learned in the war that looking like you'd already won was half the battle. The other half was being willing to kill everyone who disagreed. He found Lyra in the dining hall looking like she'd slept about as well as he had. The cut above her eye had started bruising into spectacular colors. She wore a dress Marin must have provided, deep gray wool that fit well enough but clearly wasn't tailored for her. She looked up when Ronan entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd been waiting for bad news. Vexley moved faster than expected, Ronan said without preamble. He's filed criminal charges and requested parliamentary intervention. We're signing the marriage contracts today and filing before he can block it legally. Lyra absorbed this with the kind of calm that came from already having survived the worst night of your life. How soon? Seraphine will be here by noon with the legal team. We sign, we file, and by tonight you're legally untouchable as Duchess of Blackthorne. Ronan sat across from her. But before that happens, I need to understand exactly what evidence we have and how it connects. Because once we make this official, Vexley is going to throw everything he has at discrediting both you and the documents. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped folder. I've spent 8 months memorizing every page. The smuggling network runs through 6 port cities with customs officials on payroll. The murder list includes 17 names I can verify and 13 more that are probable but harder to prove. Catherine Ashford was the most recent, but she wasn't the first servant who died after seeing something she shouldn't have. Ronan opened the folder and began reading with the methodical attention he'd once given to battlefield intelligence. The documents were damning in their specificity. Dates matched shipments. Payroll records corresponded to known enforcers. The letters discussing territory division were written in careful political language, but the meaning was clear to anyone who understood how corruption operated at this level. This isn't just Vexley, he said after 20 minutes of silence. This network involves at least 6 parliamentary lords and probably double that in supporting roles. If we release this publicly, we're not attacking one man. We're attacking the infrastructure that keeps half the government functional. Good. Lyra's voice was flat. Because half the government is built on corruption and murder. My father died trying to expose a fraction of this. Catherine died because she was in the wrong hallway. How many more people have to die before someone with enough power decides to do something about it? Ronan looked at her across the table. Really looked at her for the first time since she'd crashed into his life 12 hours ago. She wasn't performing outrage, wasn't exaggerating for effect. She meant every word with the kind of absolute conviction that usually got people killed. She reminded him of himself before the war taught him that conviction was expensive. You understand what you're asking for? The parliamentary inquiry alone could take months, the trial even longer. And during all of that, Vexley and everyone connected to him will do everything possible to destroy your credibility, dig up every mistake you've ever made, and paint you as a liar, a thief, and a manipulator who seduced a duke to avoid justice. He held her gaze. They'll make you into a villain. They'll make this marriage look like a scheme. And they'll do it so effectively that by the time we get to trial, half the kingdom will believe you're the real criminal. Let them try. Lyra's smile was the kind that came right before violence. I've spent 6 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated like I don't matter because I'm nobody with no power and no voice. Now I'm about to become a duchess married to the most terrifying man in Ashenmere. They can call me whatever they want. They can question my motives. But they can't ignore me anymore. And that's all I need. Attention. A platform. and enough legal protection that when I stand up in front of Parliament and tell them exactly what Lord Vexley has done, they have to listen. Fair enough. Ronan closed the folder. Then we proceed as planned. Marriage contracts at noon, public filing by evening. And tomorrow we start building the legal case that turns this evidence into convictions instead of accusations. What happens between now and noon? Now? Ronan stood. Now you learn how to be a duchess. Because if you're going to survive Parliament, you need to understand how power works in aristocratic circles. And I need to make sure you can defend yourself if someone gets past the guards. I thought we covered self-defense last night. We covered how to kill someone in close quarters. That's different from defending yourself in a room full of hostile aristocrats who want to destroy you without violence. He gestured toward the door. Come on, lesson 2 starts now. He led her through the keep's interior to a room she hadn't seen yet. It was set up like a smaller version of the palace ballroom. Polished floors, formal furniture arranged for social gatherings. Even a small string quartet set up in the corner, though no musicians occupied it. The space felt like a training ground designed to look like civilization. This is where I learned how to navigate noble society after I came back from the war. Ronan moved to the center of the room. The battlefield up north was straightforward. You saw the enemy. You killed the enemy. You held the position. But aristocratic warfare is different. The weapons are words. The attacks come disguised as compliments. And losing means social destruction instead of death, which for most nobles is worse. And you think I need to learn this? I think you're about to walk into the most hostile social environment in the kingdom. Parliament will be full of people who want you discredited, humiliated, or dead. You need to know how to stand in front of them without breaking. Ronan stopped and faced her. So show me. Someone at the parliamentary inquiry calls you a liar and a whore who seduced a duke to avoid justice. What do? Lyra's expression went cold. I tell them that their desperation to discredit me only proves how afraid they are of what I know. Good start. But you can't show anger. The moment you react emotionally, they win. You need to stay calm. Clinical. Treat their attacks like they're beneath your notice. Ronan demonstrated the expression, that flat, disinterested look that had made nobles uncomfortable since he learned to weaponize it. Like this. Nothing they say touches you because you're operating on a different level entirely. Lyra tried to copy the expression. It came out harder than his, more defiant than dismissive. Better. But you're still showing them they got to you. Try again. They spent the next hour drilling aristocratic combat. How to hold eye contact long enough to establish dominance without triggering confrontation. How to use silence as a weapon. How to turn insults into opportunities by refusing to acknowledge them as attacks. It was psychological warfare disguised as etiquette. And Ronan had learned every trick of it during 3 years of mandatory social functions he'd rather have avoided by dying. Lyra was good at it. Better than he'd expected. She had the instinct for power dynamics that came from surviving in hostile environments. She just needed to learn how to weaponize it properly. By the time Marin interrupted to announce Seraphine's arrival, Lyra was holding herself differently. Not softer exactly, just more controlled. Like she'd learned how to compress all that anger into something dense and dangerous instead of explosive. "You're ready?" Ronan said. "I was always ready." Lyra met his eyes. "I've been preparing for this for 6 years. I just needed someone powerful enough to make them listen." "Then let's go make it official." Seraphine arrived with 3 lawyers, a notary, and enough documentation to start a small library. She swept into Blackthorne Keep's formal receiving room like she owned it, which technically she sort of did given the Valicrest family dynamics. "The contracts are straightforward," she began without preamble. "Standard marriage agreement between Duke Ronan Valicrest and Miss Lyra Everwyn. Upon signing, Miss Everwyn becomes Duchess of Blackthorne with all attendant legal rights, protections, and responsibilities. Any attack against her person is treated as an attack against the Valicrest bloodline with appropriate consequences." She looked between Ronan and Lyra. "I've also included provisions for separate residences, independent finances, and dissolution terms if you both decide this arrangement has outlived its usefulness. You're free to negotiate changes before signing." Ronan read through the contract with the attention to detail that had kept him alive through multiple assassination attempts. The language was precise, clinical. It reduced marriage to a series of legal obligations and mutual protections, which was exactly what they both needed. "This works," he said. Lyra was reading her copy with the same intensity. When she reached the section about dissolution terms, she paused. This says we can end the marriage by mutual agreement after the threat is neutralized. Define threat. Seraphine's smile was sharp. However you both choose to define it. If that means after Vexley is convicted, then that's the timeline. If it means after the entire corruption network is dismantled, then it takes however long that requires. The contract is intentionally flexible because neither of you can predict how long you'll need this arrangement to remain in force. And if we disagree on the definition, then you negotiate like adults or you stay married. Seraphine's tone suggested she found the whole situation entertaining in a vaguely alarming way. The contract protects both of you. What you do with that protection is your business. Lyra looked at Ronan. Any objections? None. This is a tactical arrangement with clear parameters. The personal details are irrelevant to the legal function. He picked up the pen the notary offered. Unless you have concerns, just one. Lyra set down her copy and faced him directly. I need to know that you're committed to seeing this through. Not just the marriage, not just keeping me alive, but actually destroying Vexley's network and everyone connected to it. Because if you're planning to use this evidence for political leverage and then negotiate a settlement that lets him walk, I need to know now. The room went very quiet. Ronan studied her with the same assessment he'd give to a soldier asking if he'd abandon them under fire. The question wasn't insulting, it was practical. She needed to know if he'd break under pressure. I don't negotiate with people who kill servants to protect smuggling operations. His voice was flat. I don't compromise with corruption networks that turn government into organized crime, and I especially don't make settlements with men who murder investigators and expect to face no consequences. So no, there will be no deal, no compromise. We release the evidence. We testify. We prosecute. And we don't stop until Vexley and everyone connected to him is either imprisoned or ruined so completely they wish they were. That's the commitment I'm making, not just to you, to every person who died, because no one with power cared enough to stop it. Lyra's expression softened slightly. Not much. Just enough to suggest something underneath the armor had recognized something underneath his. Okay, she said quietly. Then let's do this. They signed the contract side by side at the massive oak table in Blackthorne's formal receiving room. Ronan's signature was sharp and controlled. Lyra's was smaller but just as definitive. The notary witnessed and sealed with wax bearing the Valicrest crest. 3 lawyers countersigned. Seraphine added her own signature as family witness. And just like that, Lyra Everwin became Duchess of Blackthorne. She looked at the contract like it was both weapon and shield. Then she looked at Ronan with an expression he couldn't quite parse. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. We still have to survive what comes next. Seraphine was already organizing the next move with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. The contracts go to the royal registrar within the hour. I'll file them personally to prevent any delay or interference. By tonight, every lord and minister in Ashenmere will know that Lyra is legally untouchable. She turned to Ronan. You need to make a public statement. Something that makes it very clear what the consequences will be if anyone moves against her. Ronan had been planning that statement since last night. I'll address Parliament directly tomorrow. Full formal session, every lord and minister in attendance. He looked at Lyra. And you'll be there beside me. Not as evidence, not as a victim. As my wife and a duchess with every legal right to speak before the assembly. They'll try to block that, one of the lawyers interjected. Parliamentary procedure allows them to challenge a duchess's right to testify if they claim bias, or then they can file their challenges and watch them fail. Ronan's voice had gone cold. My wife has evidence of criminal conspiracy involving multiple parliamentary lords. She has the legal right and moral obligation to present that evidence. Anyone who tries to prevent her testimony will discover exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect Valicrest interests. The lawyer went very pale and stopped objecting. Seraphine gathered the contracts and her legal team. I'll have these filed within 2 hours. After that, you're officially married and Lyra is officially protected. She paused at the door. Try not to start any wars before I get back. She left in a swirl of expensive fabric and barely contained satisfaction. Ronan and Lyra stood in the receiving room in the sudden silence. Married. It didn't feel real. It felt like another tactical decision in a long series of decisions made because they were necessary rather than wanted. So, Lyra said finally, what now? Now? Ronan looked at his wife. Now we prepare for tomorrow. You'll need proper attire for Parliament. Something that makes you look like a duchess instead of someone playing dress-up. Marin will handle that. And we need to rehearse your testimony until you can deliver it under hostile cross-examination without breaking. And you? What will you be doing? Ronan smiled. It was not a comforting expression. I'll be making it very clear to every lord in Ashenmere exactly what happens to people who threaten my wife. He left her there and headed for his study, where he drafted the statement that would either protect her or trigger a political catastrophe so severe it would reshape the kingdom's power structure. Probably both. The letter was addressed to every member of parliament and every major noble house in Ashenmere. Ronan kept it short, direct, the kind of message that left no room for misinterpretation. It began, "As of this date, Miss Lyra Everwyn has become Duchess of Blackthorne through legal marriage to Duke Ronan Valcrest. She is afforded all protections, rights, and privileges of the Valcrest bloodline. Any action taken against her person, reputation, or legal standing will be treated as a direct assault on the Valcrest family and answered with appropriate force." The second paragraph detailed the evidence in Lyra's possession and announced her intention to testify before Parliament regarding criminal corruption involving multiple lords and ministers. The final paragraph was shorter. "The Duchess of Blackthorne is under my protection. I suggest everyone remember what that means." He signed it, sealed it with the Valcrest crest, had it copied and dispatched to every relevant address in the kingdom. Then he sat back and waited for the explosion. It came faster than expected. Lord Vexley's response arrived by armed courier before sunset. The letter was polite in language but threatening in substance. It questioned the legitimacy of the marriage, suggested the Duchess had coerced a war hero suffering from battlefield trauma, demanded immediate investigation into whether the documents had been forged, and finished with a thinly veiled threat about how regrettable it would be if the Valcrest family found itself isolated from parliamentary support due to its protection of a known criminal. Ronan read it twice. Then he did something he rarely allowed himself. He laughed. It was a cold sound, empty of humor, but it was laughter nonetheless. Marin appeared in the doorway like she'd been summoned by the noise. "That's disturbing. You laughing is disturbing. What happened?" "Vexley just made a mistake." Ronan handed her the letter. "He's threatening to isolate us politically if we don't hand over Lyra and the evidence. Which means he's scared enough to show weakness. And weakness is what I need. You're enjoying this. I'm recognizing opportunity. There's a difference." Ronan stood and moved to the window where Blackthorne Keep's walls dropped away into northern cliffs that had witnessed centuries of violence. "Vexley thinks parliamentary isolation is a threat, but I've been isolated since I came back from the war. Every lord in this kingdom already fears me. They already avoid me. They already treat me like I'm something dangerous that might explode if handled wrong." He turned to Marin. "So what exactly does Vexley think he can take from me that I haven't already lost? Your family's political influence, your trade agreements, you're all replaceable, all worth sacrificing if it means destroying a corruption network that's been killing people for years." Ronan picked up his response letter and began writing. "Vexley's mistake is thinking I care about maintaining power through political favor, but I learned in the war that real power comes from being willing to lose everything except the objective. And my objective is making sure my wife stays alive long enough to watch him burn." He finished the response letter in less than 5 minutes. It was shorter than Vexley's threat. "Lord Vexley, your concern for my well-being is noted and dismissed. The Duchess of Blackthorne will testify before Parliament as scheduled. The evidence will be presented in full. You are welcome to mount whatever legal defense you believe appropriate. But understand clearly, any further threats against my wife will be answered not through parliamentary procedure, but through methods I refined during 2 years of northern campaigns. I suggest you consult historical records of what happened to the last army that threatened something under Valcrest protection. Duke Ronan Valcrest." He sealed it, had it dispatched immediately. Then he went to find Lyra because she needed to know exactly what storm was about to break over them both. He found her in the library that occupied the keep's western tower. She was reading through legal texts with the focus of someone who understood that knowledge was armor in aristocratic warfare. She looked up when Ronan entered. "Vexley responded to your statement." She didn't ask, just stated fact like she'd been expecting this. Ronan handed her both letters. She read Vexley's threat first. Her expression didn't change. Then she read Ronan's response, and something that might have been satisfaction crossed her face. "You threatened him with military action. I clarified consequences." "There's a difference." Ronan sat across from her in one of the library's massive leather chairs. He's trying to isolate us politically, make it too expensive to protect you. The response needed to make clear that political isolation isn't a meaningful threat. Is it true? What you wrote about the northern campaigns? Which part? The part about what happened to the last army that threatened something under your protection. Ronan was quiet for a moment. The library's silence was heavy with the weight of old books and older violence. We were holding a supply line through hostile territory. The enemy commander sent word that if we didn't surrender the route, he'd execute the civilian population in the nearest town. 200 people. He met her eyes. I sent back a message that if he harmed a single civilian under my protection, I would burn his entire army to ash and scatter the survivors across 3 kingdoms as a warning to anyone else who mistook mercy for weakness. And he executed 5 civilians to prove he was serious. So I spent the next 3 weeks hunting down every soldier in his command. We didn't take prisoners. We didn't negotiate surrender. We just systematically eliminated every person who'd been involved in the decision until there was nothing left but bodies and the understanding that some lines don't get crossed. Ronan's voice was flat. The town survived. My reputation got worse, and I stopped sleeping properly because apparently your brain doesn't differentiate between necessary violence and the kind that makes you a monster. Lyra studied him with that too intense gaze she'd been using since they met. Are you telling me this to scare me or to prepare me? Both. You need to understand what you've married into. I'm not just powerful, I'm brutal when circumstances require it. And circumstances are about to require exactly that level of response, because Vexley isn't going to stop with threats. He's going to escalate. So you need to know that the man protecting you is capable of terrible things when protecting becomes the objective. Good, Lyra said simply. Because the man who killed my father and Catherine and 17 other people doesn't respond to polite requests and legal procedures. He responds to power, to fear, to the understanding that continuing his current path means destruction. So if you're asking whether I'm comfortable being married to someone who's willing to be brutal in defense of his objectives, the answer is yes, absolutely, without reservation. The directness of her response did something strange to Ronan's chest, some kind of tightness he couldn't identify. You're very certain about that. I spent 6 years planning revenge. I've thought through every moral compromise, every ethical boundary, every line I'd have to cross. And I decided years ago that I'd rather become something harder than watch good people keep dying, because I wasn't willing to do what was necessary. She closed the legal text. So, yes, I'm certain. Now tell me what happens next. Next is tomorrow. We go to Parliament. I make a statement establishing that you're under absolute protection. You present preliminary evidence. And then we watch Vexley's allies try to discredit everything while we build the case that turns accusations into convictions. They'll attack me personally. Yes. They'll question my motives, my morals, my legitimacy as a duchess. Yes. And you're going to let them. Ronan leaned forward. I'm going to let them try. Because every attack they make in public is evidence of desperation. Every attempt to discredit you makes them look more guilty of exactly what you're accusing them of. The cross-examination isn't a problem. It's opportunity. You just need to stay calm while they exhaust themselves attacking someone who refuses to break. Lyra smiled. That I can do. Breaking stopped being an option somewhere around the time I watched my father's body pulled from the river. Then we're ready. They spent the rest of the evening reviewing parliamentary procedure and rehearsing responses to hostile questions. Ronan played the role of aggressive cross-examiner while Lyra practiced staying composed under verbal assault. She was better at it than most soldiers he'd trained, better at controlling her reactions, better at weaponizing silence and calm in the face of provocation. By the time they stopped, the sky outside had gone dark, and Blackthorne Keep's corridors were lit by torchlight that turned stone walls into something from mythology. Get some sleep, Ronan said. Tomorrow is going to be brutal. Lyra stood but didn't immediately leave. She looked at him with an expression that was part exhaustion and part something else. Something that looked like gratitude trying to exist in someone who'd forgotten how to trust it. Thank you, she said quietly. For all of this. For believing me. For protecting me. For not treating me like I'm fragile or helpless or someone who needs to be saved from herself. You're not fragile. You're tactically competent and strategically ruthless. That's more valuable than fragile any day. Ronan stood. Now go sleep. I need you sharp tomorrow. She left, Ronan listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor toward her quarters. Then he returned to his maps and battle plans and the growing certainty that tomorrow would either establish Lyra as untouchable or trigger a conflict that would burn through the kingdom like fire through paper. He found himself hoping they both survived it. The realization bothered him more than it should have. Midnight found him still awake, staring at tactical projections and trying to predict every angle of attack Vexley might employ. The fortress was quiet except for guard rotations and wind hammering against stone. This was the time Ronan usually spent fighting memories of the northern campaigns. Tonight the memories were quieter, replaced by something that felt like anticipation. A knock interrupted the silence. Ronan looked up to find Lyra in the doorway. She wore a simple nightgown and looked like she'd been trying to sleep without success. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. Ronan gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sleep is negotiable. Planning isn't." Lyra sat. She looked at the maps spread across every surface. "This is what you do, instead of sleeping? This is how I stay alive, how I keep other people alive." Ronan didn't look away from the tactical projections. "The war taught me that the side that plans better survives longer. So I plan obsessively. I game out every scenario. I prepare for contingencies most people don't consider possible. And then when violence arrives, I'm ready." Does it work? 60% of the time. The other 40%, people die anyway, and I get to spend the rest of my life cataloging what I should have predicted differently. Lyra was quiet. Then, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "The butcher. The monster nobles whisper about at parties. Someone brutal and empty and incapable of caring about anything except violence and control." She looked at him directly. "But that's not what you are. You're just someone who learned that caring too much gets people killed, so you pretend not to care at all while actually caring more than anyone else in the room." Ronan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. That's a very generous interpretation of someone who spent 3 years making everyone uncomfortable. It's an accurate interpretation of someone who holds impossible positions because if you don't hold them, people die. She paused. "I recognize it because I've been doing the same thing, pretending I'm motivated by revenge, when really I'm just trying to make sure no one else's father ends up in the river because he cared about justice." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt less empty than most conversations. Finally, Ronan spoke. "You should know something before tomorrow. Once we walk into Parliament and make this official, there's no walking it back. Vexley will use every resource to destroy you. His allies will coordinate attacks. The media will turn you into a scandal. And throughout all of it, you'll be standing next to me while people who already hate me decide you're equally monstrous for marrying the butcher. It's going to be worse than you're imagining." "Good," Lyra said, "because I don't want easy. I don't want comfortable. I want Vexley broken and his network dismantled and everyone who helped him terrified that they're next. And if that means enduring scandal and hatred and public crucifixion, then that's what I'll endure." She met his eyes. "You asked earlier if I was certain about this marriage, about allying myself with someone brutal. I am, because brutal is what's needed, and I'd rather stand next to someone willing to be brutal in defense of something worth protecting than someone who's gentle while people keep dying." Ronan looked at his wife and felt the uncomfortable sensation of being genuinely understood by someone who shouldn't be able to parse his particular brand of damage. "You should still sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow starts early, so should you." "I don't sleep well, neither do I." Lyra stood but paused at the door. "So maybe we just accept that we're both broken in complementary ways and stop pretending we're functional." She left before Ronan could respond. He sat alone in his study, surrounded by maps and tactical projections, and the growing realization that his careful isolation was being dismantled by someone who'd walked into his life less than 48 hours ago. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like the first strategic advantage he'd gained since the war ended. Dawn came too fast, and with it the certainty that everything was about to change in ways none of them could control. Ronan dressed in full formal regalia, the kind of aristocratic armor that announced status through tailoring and intimidation through presence. Black coat with silver threading, the Valicrest crest displayed prominently, boots that made his footsteps sound like declarations of war. He found Lyra already awake and being dressed by Marin in the kind of gown that transformed servant into duchess. Deep blue silk that matched her eyes. Hair arranged in the elaborate style favored by aristocratic women. Jewelry that cost more than most people earned in 5 years. She looked like power-wearing civilization as camouflage. Ready? Ronan asked from the doorway. Lyra turned to face him. Her expression was calm, focused, the look of someone about to walk into battle and already planning 3 moves ahead. I've been ready for 6 years. Let's go burn his world down. They walked out of Blackthorne Keep together toward the carriages that would take them to Parliament. Behind them, the fortress locked down for siege. Ahead, the entire political establishment of Ashenmere waited to tear them both apart. And somewhere in the parliamentary halls, Lord Vexley was learning that he'd made the catastrophic mistake of threatening the one woman in the kingdom now protected by someone who'd forgotten how to lose without destroying everything in the process. The war hadn't ended with the northern campaigns. It had just found new battlefields. And this time Ronan wasn't fighting to hold positions. He was fighting to burn them down. The parliamentary hall was designed to make people feel small. 3 stories of marble columns rising toward a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of historical conquest. 600 seats arranged in ascending tiers like an amphitheater built for executions disguised as debate. Every surface polished until it reflected light and sound, back at anyone foolish enough to stand at the center. Ronan had addressed Parliament twice before. Both times to report casualty numbers from the northern campaigns, while lords who'd never seen combat questioned his tactical decisions. He'd learned then that this building wasn't designed for truth. It was designed for theater, for the performance of power by people who confused talking about violence with understanding it. Today felt different. Today he wasn't reporting, he was declaring war. The carriage stopped at the Parliament's eastern entrance where crowds had already gathered. News of the marriage had spread through Ashenmere like fire through kindling. People pressed against barriers held by royal guards, shouting questions that nobody answered. Some held signs supporting the Duchess. Others demanded her arrest. The division was clean and absolute. No middle ground, just 2 sides preparing for conflict. Lyra sat across from Ronan in the carriage, watching the crowd through tinted glass. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who'd spent 6 years preparing for this moment and refused to let fear show in the final hour. "They're going to tear me apart in there," she said quietly. "Yes. And you're going to let them try." "Yes." Ronan met her eyes. "Because every attack they make in public creates legal precedent for our counterattack. They'll accuse you of fabricating evidence. We'll demand independent verification. They'll question your character. We'll question theirs. The cross-examination isn't the danger. The danger is losing your composure while they're trying to break you. I won't break. I know. That's why we're doing this." The carriage door opened. Royal guards formed a corridor through the crowd. Ronan stepped out first, his presence creating instant silence in the immediate vicinity. People who'd been shouting found urgent reasons to stop making noise when the butcher of the northern campaigns looked in their general direction. He turned and offered his hand to Lyra. She took it and stepped down beside him with the kind of controlled grace that suggested Marin's crash course in aristocratic deportment had been effective. Together, they walked through the crowd toward Parliament's entrance. Behind them, Seraphine followed with the legal team and enough documentation to build a case that would either reform the government or destroy it entirely. The interior corridors were packed with nobles, ministers, and parliamentary staff all trying to look like they had legitimate business, while actually positioning themselves to witness history. Ronan ignored them with the same efficiency he'd used to ignore enemy scouts during the war. Irrelevant variables, background noise that didn't affect the objective. Lord Cassian Vexley waited in the parliamentary lobby like a spider at the center of a web. He was 50-something with the kind of face that photographed well, but looked predatory in person. Silver gray hair, expensive suit tailored to hide the softness that came from decades of corruption instead of labor. Eyes that calculated profit before ethics in every situation. He was surrounded by 6 other lords who'd clearly been coordinating strategy. They all wore the expression of people who believed power was permanent and consequences were things that happened to other people. Vexley's smile was the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Duke Ronan, how unexpected to see you actually appear. I'd half convinced myself you'd realize the impossibility of this position and withdraw gracefully." He looked at Lyra like she was livestock being evaluated. "And this must be the former Miss Everwyn. Or should I say, the accused thief currently hiding behind a marriage of convenience. You should say Duchess of Blackthorne." Ronan's voice was flat. "And you should remember that any further defamatory statements about my wife create legal liability that I will personally ensure you experience in the most unpleasant way possible." The lobby went silent. Vexley's smile hardened. My apologies, Your Grace. I meant no disrespect. Though I'm sure you understand that questions about the legitimacy of a marriage contracted mere hours after the bride fled from criminal accusations are natural and appropriate. Question whatever you like. Ronan stepped closer. Vexley's allies instinctively backed away. But understand that my wife is here to present evidence of criminal conspiracy involving smuggling, murder, and corruption across 6 parliamentary districts. She has documentation, witnesses, and most importantly, she has Valacrest protection. So your options are either address the evidence or continue making personal attacks that only demonstrate how desperate you are to avoid accountability. Vexley's eyes were cold. We shall see what Parliament decides about the credibility of evidence stolen by a servant with clear motivation to fabricate accusations against her employer. Then I look forward to watching you explain that theory under oath. Ronan gestured toward the parliamentary chamber. Shall we begin? They entered the chamber in formation. Ronan and Lyra at the center. Seraphine and the legal team flanking them like a military escort. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Every lord and minister who could manufacture an excuse to be present had arrived to witness either vindication or disaster. The Lord Speaker presided from an elevated platform that made him look like a judge preparing for execution. He was 70 and had held the position for 2 decades through careful neutrality and the political instinct to never take sides until the winner was obvious. This parliamentary session is called to address accusations of criminal misconduct brought forward by Duchess Lyra Valacrest of Blackthorne and allegations of theft and defamation raised by Lord Cassian Vexley. He paused. Given the severity of both claims, we will hear preliminary evidence from both parties before determining how to proceed. Duke Ronan, you may present your statement. Ronan stood. The chamber's acoustics carried his voice to every corner without need for shouting. Members of Parliament, Lords and Ministers of Ashenmere, I stand before you today not as a general reporting military outcomes, but as a duke defending his wife against coordinated attacks designed to prevent testimony about criminal activity at the highest levels of government. His eyes swept the chamber. Duchess Lyra Valacrest possesses documentary evidence of a smuggling network operating through 6 port cities with explicit cooperation from customs officials and parliamentary oversight. She has payroll records for hired enforcers who committed murder to protect these operations. She has correspondence between multiple lords discussing territory division and profit sharing. And she has proof that Lord Cassian Vexley personally ordered the death of a servant girl named Catherine Ashford 2 nights ago because Miss Ashford discovered documents exposing his involvement. The chamber erupted in noise, shouting, objections, demands for order. The Lord Speaker hammered for silence. It took 3 minutes to restore enough quiet for proceedings to continue. Those are extraordinary accusations, the Speaker said carefully. Do you have evidence to support them? Seraphine stood and gestured to the legal team. They began distributing copies of documents to every parliamentary minister. Ledgers, letters, personnel records, the entire architecture of corruption laid out in careful detail. Ronan watched Vexley's face. The man didn't look surprised, didn't look afraid. He looked like someone who'd been expecting this and had already planned 3 moves ahead. That realization arrived with the cold weight of tactical error. Vexley stood before anyone could finish reading. I object to this entire proceeding on grounds that the so-called evidence was obtained through theft, forgery, and criminal trespass. These documents were stolen from my private office by a servant who had already been dismissed for previous theft. Any claims based on illegally obtained materials should be dismissed immediately. Another lord stood. Marcus Thorne, one of Vexley's known allies. I second that objection. Additionally, I move that we investigate how Miss Everwyn, the Duchess, came to be under Valacrest protection. The timeline suggests possible coercion or manipulation of a war veteran suffering from documented battlefield trauma. Ronan felt something cold settle in his chest. They'd coordinated this. Prepared counterarguments before the session even started. This wasn't improvised defense, this was strategy. A third lord stood. Gerald Ashford. Ronan didn't know him well, but knew his reputation. Moderate, reasonable. The kind of voice people listened to because he rarely took extreme positions. I share concerns about the provenance of these documents. However, I also believe we have a responsibility to investigate serious accusations regardless of how evidence was obtained. I move that we establish an independent committee to verify authenticity before proceeding further. That sounded reasonable. That sounded like exactly what should happen, which meant it was a trap. Ronan caught Seraphine's eye. She gave a microscopic nod. She'd seen it too. The Lord Speaker considered. That seems appropriate. I'll establish a verification committee of 5 neutral lords to examine the evidence over the next 6 weeks and report findings. 6 weeks? Lyra's voice cut through the chamber. 6 weeks during which Lord Vexley remains free to destroy additional evidence, intimidate witnesses, and potentially harm anyone else who knows too much? That's not verification, that's providing time for cover-up. The chamber went silent. Duchess Lyra, the speaker said carefully. You'll have opportunity to testify, but parliamentary procedure requires... Your procedure is designed to protect lords from accountability. Lyra stood. She hadn't raised her voice, but the intensity made every word carry. Catherine Ashford was 17 years old. She died because she was in the wrong hallway at the wrong time, and Lord Vexley decided murder was more convenient than explanation. My father died 6 years ago investigating the same network. How many more people have to die while Parliament follows procedure designed to ensure nobody powerful ever faces consequences? That was the moment Ronan saw it coming. Gerald Ashford stood again. His expression was sympathetic, compassionate, the perfect mask for what came next. Duchess Lyra, I understand your pain. Truly. Catherine Ashford was my niece, my brother's youngest daughter, and I want justice for her death as much as you do. He paused. But I also want to ensure that justice is based on truth rather than vengeance. You've suffered tremendous loss. Your father's death clearly traumatized you. And now you've entered into a marriage with a man known for brutality and violence in what appears to be an attempt to gain protection and power to pursue revenge. That's understandable. Human. But it's also exactly the kind of emotional state that leads to false accusations and fabricated evidence. Ronan felt the trap close like jaws. Ashford continued, I'm suggesting that we provide Duchess Lyra with counseling and support while independently investigating her claims. Not because I believe she's lying intentionally, but because trauma can create false memories, and vengeance can manufacture evidence that feels true to the person creating it. It was brilliant, devastating. Ashford had just reframed the entire situation from criminal accusation to trauma response, from evidence to emotional breakdown. And he'd done it while expressing sympathy that made objecting seem cruel. The chamber murmured agreement, reasonable voices supporting reasonable caution. Lyra's face had gone pale, not with fear, with the recognition that the ground had just shifted beneath her. Ronan stood. Lord Ashford's concern is noted. However, his suggestion fundamentally misunderstands the nature of documentary evidence. My wife isn't asking you to believe her memories. She's asking you to verify physical documents that exist independent of her emotional state. But that's exactly the question, another lord interjected. How do we know these documents are authentic? How do we know they weren't created specifically to support a revenge narrative? Because the details are too specific and too corroborated to be fabrication. Seraphine's voice was cold. These ledgers contain shipping manifests that match customs records, personnel files that correspond to known enforcers, correspondence that references events verified through independent sources. You can question how the evidence was obtained. You can question the legality of acquisition. But questioning authenticity requires ignoring everything we know about how forgery actually works. Then let the verification committee do their job. Vexley sounded reasonable, patient, like he was being generous by allowing investigation at all. 6 weeks to authenticate documents and interview witnesses seems like minimal due diligence given the severity of accusations. The Lord Speaker nodded. I agree. The verification committee will... A messenger burst through the chamber's rear entrance. He ran down the central aisle with complete disregard for parliamentary protocol. Guards moved to intercept, but he was already at the speaker's platform, thrusting a sealed envelope into official hands. The speaker opened it, read for 30 seconds. His face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like horror. He stood. The chamber quieted instantly. I've just received word from the Royal Magistrate's office. Early this morning, a fire broke out at the warehouse where Lord Vexley stores his commercial records. The building burned completely, all contents destroyed. He looked directly at Vexley. That warehouse allegedly contained the original documents that Duchess Lyra claims to have copied. Ronan felt the world narrow to a single point of terrible clarity. The originals were gone. The source material that would have proven the documents were copies rather than forgeries had been destroyed, which meant every piece of evidence they had could now be dismissed as fabrication. Vexley's expression was perfectly calibrated shock and concern. That's devastating news. Those records represented years of legitimate business documentation. I'll of course cooperate fully with investigations into the fire's cause. Though I have to say, the timing is remarkably convenient for anyone who wanted to claim those records contained evidence of criminal activity while ensuring no one could verify the original context. He'd done it. Burned his own records to eliminate proof that Lyra's documents were authentic copies. And he'd done it before Parliament convened so he could frame the timing as suspicious rather than self-incriminating. Lyra was standing very still, too still, the kind of stillness that came right before someone broke or exploded. Ronan caught her hand under the table. Squeezed once. Not comfort, warning. She was surrounded by enemies looking for any sign of emotional collapse to confirm Ashford's trauma narrative. She squeezed back, understanding, control. But Ronan could feel her shaking. The speaker looked genuinely troubled. In light of this development, I'm ordering a full investigation into both the fire and the documentary evidence. The verification committee will examine every claim. But until we establish authenticity and address questions about illegal acquisition, I'm suspending any action based on these accusations. It was over. Not permanently, not irrevocably. But for now, Vexley had won the first battle. The session dissolved into chaos. Nobles arguing, reporters pressing forward, guards trying to maintain order. And through it all, Vexley stood surrounded by allies wearing expressions of concern that barely masked satisfaction. Ronan pulled Lyra toward the exit. Seraphine and the legal team formed a protective barrier. They moved through corridors that felt more hostile than battlefields because at least in war, the enemy was obvious. The carriage waited in the courtyard. They climbed inside and the door sealed behind them with the finality of a coffin lid. For 30 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Lyra said very quietly, "He destroyed the evidence. He destroyed the originals." Ronan's mind was already running tactical analysis. Your copies are still valid. But without source material to prove they're authentic copies rather than forgeries, the burden of proof just got exponentially harder. Gerald Ashford set me up. Her voice was empty. He used his niece's death, used my father's murder, framed my entire testimony as trauma response. And he did it while sounding sympathetic enough that half the chamber probably thinks he's being compassionate, because he is Vexley's ally. Probably compromised. Possibly complicit. Seraphine looked furious in the controlled way that meant someone was going to regret existing. Ashford positioned himself as the reasonable moderate, asking reasonable questions. It's exactly the kind of political theater that makes corruption impossible to prosecute. The carriage rolled through Ashenmere streets. Crowds had already gathered outside Parliament, some throwing things, some cheering. The city was tearing itself apart over whether the Duchess was victim or villain. Ronan watched Lyra's face. She was doing the calculations, realizing that 6 years of planning had just been dismantled by a man who'd burned his own records and an ally who'd weaponized compassion. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now?" Ronan looked at the city passing outside. "Now we adapt. Vexley won the first engagement. That doesn't mean he wins the war. We have 6 weeks before the committee reports. 6 weeks to find evidence he can't burn, witnesses he can't silence, documentation that exists outside his control. He owns half the witnesses. He spent years making sure nothing exists outside his control." Lyra's voice was cracking at the edges. This was supposed to work. The evidence was supposed to be enough. Evidence is never enough against someone who controls the systems designed to evaluate evidence. Ronan had learned that in the war, had watched soldiers die because command didn't believe field reports that contradicted comfortable assumptions. The problem isn't your documentation. The problem is that Parliament isn't designed to hold lords accountable. It's designed to protect them while performing accountability for public consumption. Then what's the point? Why did we do any of this if the system is rigged? Because sometimes you have to break the system. Ronan met her eyes. "You came to me asking for war. Well, this is what war looks like when it's fought in parliamentary chambers instead of battlefields. The enemy adapts. Plans fail. And you either retreat or escalate. So the question is whether you're ready to escalate. Escalate how?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Seraphine looked at him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly what he was thinking and wasn't sure it was survivable. By making Vexley's victory so expensive, he regrets winning. By taking every resource he used to discredit you and turning it into evidence against him. By proving that the verification committee is compromised and the fire was arson and every reasonable question was actually coordinated obstruction. He leaned forward. But that kind of escalation requires going after people who are currently protected by parliamentary immunity and social status. It requires making enemies of half the lords in Ashenmere. And it requires accepting that we might destroy our own reputation in the process of destroying theirs. I don't care about reputation, Lyra said. You will when they finish painting you as an unstable woman who manipulated a traumatized war veteran into attacking innocent lords. That's the narrative Ashford started today. And every escalation we make gives them more material to reinforce it. The carriage arrived at Blackthorne Keep. They climbed out into the courtyard where guards had already locked down the fortress for siege conditions. Marin waited at the entrance. Her expression was grim. News from the palace. 3 parliamentary lords have filed formal complaints demanding investigation into the legitimacy of your marriage. They're claiming coercion and requesting that Duchess Lyra be placed under protective custody pending psychological evaluation. There it was. The second wave of attack. Separate Lyra from Valicrest protection by claiming she needed protection from Ronan himself. Over my dead body, Ronan said flatly. That may be what they're hoping for. Marin handed him the formal complaints. They're arguing that your history of battlefield violence and social isolation makes you unsuitable to make judgments about your wife's well-being, and they're using your own statement about protecting her as evidence that you're acting possessively rather than rationally. It was sophisticated, terrible, using Ronan's protectiveness as proof he was dangerous. Lyra read the complaints over his shoulder. They're going to take me away from you, lock me up, call it protection while they make me disappear. They're going to try. Ronan looked at Marin. Increase security to maximum. No one enters the keep without my personal authorization. No judicial orders get executed without legal challenge. And get every lawyer we have working on blocking the protective custody request. Marin nodded and disappeared into the fortress. Ronan turned to Lyra. We need to talk, privately. He led her through corridors to his study, closed the door, locked it, then stood there trying to figure out how to say what needed to be said. Lyra spoke first. You're going to tell me this is more dangerous than you planned, that the cost is higher than anticipated, that I should consider accepting some kind of negotiated settlement before we both get destroyed. No. Ronan moved to the window overlooking the cliffs. I'm going to tell you that I miscalculated. I thought parliamentary theater could be managed through evidence and legal procedure. I was wrong. Vexley is better at political warfare than I gave him credit for. And the system is more comprehensively rigged than I understood. So our options now are retreat or escalation into territory that makes what we've done so far look cautious. Lyra joined him at the window. What territory? The kind where we stop trying to work within a system designed to protect corruption and start actively dismantling that system. Where we stop presenting evidence to committees that are compromised and start releasing it directly to the public. Where we stop playing by rules that were written to ensure people like Vexley never face consequences. Ronan looked at her. It means becoming exactly what they're accusing us of being. Radical. Dangerous. Willing to destroy institutions if those institutions won't serve justice. She was quiet for a long time, then, I'm listening. We bypass Parliament entirely. Release every document to independent newspapers. Name every compromised lord publicly. Force the Crown to investigate because public pressure becomes impossible to ignore. He paused. But that strategy requires accepting that we'll be painted as attempting a coup against legitimate government. It requires knowing that half the kingdom will hate us. And it requires understanding that once we start down that path, there's no walking it back. And if we don't, the verification committee spends 6 weeks producing a report that questions authenticity while Vexley consolidates power and eliminates any remaining evidence. Then the protective custody order goes through, and you disappear into some facility where no one can find you. And I spend the rest of my life knowing I failed to protect someone who trusted me because I was too cautious to do what was necessary. The weight of that statement settled between them like something physical. Lyra turned to face him directly. You've been protecting me since the moment we met. Taking risks, making enemies, turning your fortress into my sanctuary. Why? Because you were right, Ronan said quietly. When you said the system requires someone with enough power to tell Vexley to go to hell and mean it. Because I'm tired of watching good people die while bad people thrive. And because somewhere in all the tactical calculation and strategic planning, you stopped being an objective to protect and became someone I genuinely don't want to watch. Destroyed by the same corruption that's been killing people for years, the admission felt like losing ground, like tactical error, like all the careful distance he'd maintained was collapsing under its own weight. Lyra's expression was impossible to read. And if I said I want escalation, that I want to burn the entire system down if that's what it takes, then I'd say you're thinking tactically. Ronan managed something that might have been a smile if smiles weren't things he'd mostly forgotten how to do. And I'd prepare for the war we're about to start. She nodded once. Decisive. Then let's do it. Release everything. Name everyone. Make it so public they can't bury it quietly. There was a knock at the door. Urgent. Insistent. Ronan opened it to find one of the guards looking panicked. My lord, we have a situation. Someone breached the perimeter. They're claiming to have information about the warehouse fire, but they won't talk to anyone except you and the Duchess. Show them to the receiving room. Full security presence. The guard left. Ronan and Lyra exchanged looks. Could be a trap, she said. Probably is, but we can't afford to ignore potential intelligence. They walked to the receiving room where a man waited under guard supervision. He was 40-something, nervous, wearing clothes that suggested working class rather than aristocracy, and he looked terrified of being inside Blackthorne Keep. Ronan didn't sit, didn't try to appear welcoming, just stood there with the kind of presence that suggested talking quickly was advisable. You have information about the fire. The man nodded rapidly. I worked at the warehouse, security. I was on duty last night when 3 men arrived around midnight. They had authorization papers signed by Lord Vexley himself. Said they were conducting inventory audit, but I saw them carrying barrels of lamp oil. Lots of it. He swallowed. I reported it to my supervisor this morning before the fire. He told me to forget I saw anything. Then the building burned and everyone's saying it was accident, but it wasn't. It was deliberate. Do you have the authorization papers? No, sir. They took them when they left, but I remember names on the documents. And I saw faces. I could identify the men who set the fire. Why come forward now? Why risk this? Because my sister worked as a maid in one of the houses Catherine Ashford's family managed. She knew Catherine, liked her. And when I heard what happened, that Lord Vexley might have killed her, I thought about my own sister and what I'd want someone to do if she died. The man looked at Lyra. I ain't brave, I ain't important, but I saw something that matters, and I figured the new Duchess might want to know about it before they make you out to be crazy. Ronan looked at Seraphine, who'd materialized in the doorway. Can we protect him? If we move fast, get him signed testimony. Put him somewhere Vexley can't reach. Do it. Ronan turned back to the guard. You're under Valicrest protection now. We'll keep you safe while you provide testimony. And if you're lying, you'll discover exactly why people fear this family. I ain't lying, the man said. I just want to do right by Catherine. After he was escorted out, Lyra looked at Ronan with something that might have been hope. That's corroboration. Proof the fire was arson. Evidence that Vexley destroyed records deliberately. It's a start. But one guard's testimony against a parliamentary lord is still going to be challenged as unreliable or coerced. We need more. Then we find more. Lyra's voice had regained certainty. We investigate the 3 men who set the fire. We find the authorization papers or copies. We document everything until there's so much evidence they can't dismiss it all as fabrication. Ronan felt something shift. Not hope exactly. More like the recognition that retreat was no longer possible and forward was the only direction left. They spent the next 6 hours planning. Seraphine coordinated with investigators to identify the arsonists. The legal team prepared documentation for releasing evidence publicly. And Ronan drafted the statement that would either save them or destroy them completely. By midnight, they had a strategy. By dawn, they'd execute it. Ronan found Lyra in the library again around 3 in the morning. She was reading through parliamentary law like she was looking for loopholes that didn't exist. Can't sleep? He asked. Can't stop thinking about Gerald Ashford, how he used his own niece's death, how he sounded so reasonable while destroying everything. Lyra closed the book. How many other lords are just like him? Good at sounding compassionate while protecting corruption? Most of them. That's how the system survives. By putting reasonable voices in front of terrible structures and making anyone who objects sound hysterical. Ronan sat across from her, It's why evidence alone never works. The system isn't designed to evaluate evidence. It's designed to protect power. Then how do we win? We make the cost of protecting power higher than the cost of reform. We make Vexley toxic. We expose enough lords that defending him means defending themselves. And we do it publicly enough that Parliament can't bury it quietly. Ronan leaned forward. But that strategy requires accepting casualties. Our reputation, possibly our safety. Definitely our position in aristocratic society. I was never part of aristocratic society. That's not a casualty for me. It will be when they finish painting you as a dangerous radical who corrupted a war hero. Lyra smiled without humor. They already see me that way. The difference is now I have resources to fight back. The dawn light was starting to filter through the library windows. Another day. Another battle. Another chance to either advance or get destroyed trying. Ronan stood. We release everything in 3 hours. Seraphine is coordinating with 4 independent newspapers. The guard's testimony goes to the royal magistrate simultaneously. And I'm making a public statement that names every compromised lord and challenges them to sue me for defamation if they can prove I'm wrong. That's declaration of total war. Yes. Ronan looked at his wife. Last chance to retreat. We can still negotiate a settlement. Get you protected without destroying half the aristocracy. Lyra stood and met his eyes. I didn't marry you for safety. I married you for war. So let's stop hesitating and start fighting like we mean it. 3 hours later, every major newspaper in Ashenmere received sealed packages containing complete documentation of Vexley's smuggling network. Names, dates, evidence of murder, proof of arson, and testimony from witnesses who'd been too scared to speak before someone powerful enough to protect them decided corruption was more offensive than political disaster. The kingdom exploded. But just as the newspapers began printing emergency editions, Seraphine burst into Ronan's study with an expression that suggested the situation had just become catastrophically worse. We have a problem. She handed him a letter bearing the royal seal. The crown just issued an arrest warrant for Lyra. Formal charges of theft, defamation, and conspiracy to incite civil unrest. Ronan read the warrant twice. It was legal, official, backed by parliamentary recommendation from 8 lords including Gerald Ashford. And underneath the formal charges, a handwritten note in elegant script. Return the girl, stand down, and this ends quietly. Continue, and we'll ensure you both hang for treason. The choice is yours, Duke Ronan. Choose survival. Ronan looked at Lyra, who'd gone very pale but remained standing. Then he looked at this window where dawn was breaking over Ashenmere, and the newspapers were starting their print runs with evidence that would either reform the kingdom or get them both killed. The choice wasn't really a choice. It had stopped being a choice the moment Lyra threw herself into his carriage and asked for protection instead of rescue. Ronan walked to the fireplace and threw the warrant into the flames. Burn it all down, he said quietly. We're past the point of no return anyway. The warrant turned to ash in the fireplace while Ronan watched smoke curl toward the ceiling. There was something freeing about crossing lines you couldn't uncross, about finally accepting that survival and morality were luxuries you earned by winning first and justifying later. The war had taught him that lesson in blood and frozen mud. Apparently, peacetime required the same education delivered through legal documents and political theater. Seraphine was staring at the fireplace like Ronan had just set fire to their entire future, which he probably had. You just burned a royal arrest warrant. Her voice was carefully controlled. That's not defiance. That's treason. That's commitment. Ronan turned from the flames. We already released the evidence to 4 newspapers. We already named 8 parliamentary lords as corrupt. The warrant was leverage designed to make us retreat. But retreat isn't an option anymore because retreating means Lyra gets arrested and disappeared and everything we've done becomes meaningless. They'll send soldiers, royal guards. They'll lay siege to Blackthorne Keep if necessary. Good. Let them come. Ronan moved to his desk where tactical maps of the fortress were spread across every surface. I've defended worse positions with fewer resources. And unlike the northern campaigns, this time I'm defending something that matters instead of territory that didn't care who held it. Lyra had been silent during the exchange. Now she spoke quietly. You're willing to fight the crown. For me? For this. I'm willing to fight corruption that's been killing people for years while everyone with power looked the other way. Ronan met her eyes. You're part of that fight. But this stopped being just about protecting you the moment Vexley burned evidence and Ashford weaponized compassion to defend murder. Now it's about whether Ashenmere has any functional justice system, or whether power simply protects power until someone with enough force decides to break the cycle. That's sedition, Seraphine said. That's revolutionary language. That's reality. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed, to protect lords, to enable corruption, to ensure accountability is theater rather than function. Ronan's voice was flat. I spent 3 years in the North defending that system, watching good soldiers die for a kingdom that didn't care about them. And I came back thinking maybe civilization was worth the cost. But watching Parliament defend Vexley while attacking Lyra taught me something important. The system isn't worth defending, it's worth replacing. The words hung in the air like declarations of war, which they were. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. It was sharp, dangerous. The expression of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation for years. Good. I was worried you'd stay cautious. She moved to the tactical maps. If we're doing this, we need to move fast. The newspapers will hit the streets in 2 hours. That gives us maybe 4 hours before royal guards arrive with orders to arrest Lyra and probably you for harboring a fugitive. We need the fortress locked down tighter than it's ever been. We need every ally we have mobilized. And we need a public strategy that makes arresting you look like the crown defending corruption instead of enforcing law. Already planning it. Ronan gestured to the maps. Blackthorne Keep can withstand siege for 6 months if necessary. We have supplies. Water. Defensive positions that make direct assault suicidal. The question is whether we want siege or whether we want to force confrontation before they can coordinate a proper response. Force confrontation, Lyra said. Both of them looked at her. She was standing straighter now, no longer the hunted woman who'd thrown herself into a carriage 4 days ago. Something harder, more focused. If they arrest me quietly, it becomes about my crimes. But if they have to besiege a fortress to enforce an arrest warrant against someone presenting evidence of murder, it becomes about what they're protecting. We need public pressure. We need this to be so visible they can't bury it. Smart. Seraphine nodded approval. We make the arrest attempt the story instead of the charges. Frame it as powerful lords using royal authority to silence testimony. How? Ronan asked. We invite witnesses, journalists, independent observers. We announce that Duchess Lyra will address the public from Blackthorne Keep at noon today to present additional evidence about the warehouse fire. And we make it clear that anyone who wants to arrest her will have to do it in front of reporters and citizens. She paused. It forces the Crown to either back down or commit to arresting someone in the middle of presenting evidence about government corruption. Either way, we win the narrative. Or they just arrest everyone, including the journalists. Possible, but unlikely. The Crown still cares about appearance. They'll want this to look legitimate. That gives us leverage. Ronan considered the strategy. It was risky, aggressive. Exactly the kind of tactical gambit that either shattered enemy cohesion or got everyone killed. Do it. Alert every newspaper, every independent witness we trust. Get them here by noon and prepare full testimony about the warehouse fire, including the guard's statement. Seraphine left to coordinate. The door closed behind her with the finality of a battle plan being executed. Ronan looked at Lyra. You understand what we just committed to? If this fails, we don't get another chance. They'll arrest you, probably execute you for treason, and I'll either die defending you or spend whatever's left of my life imprisoned for sedition. I understand. Lyra moved closer. Her voice was steady despite everything. I also understand that 4 days ago I was running through rain-soaked streets expecting to die in an alley. Now I'm standing in a fortress surrounded by people willing to fight the Crown to protect evidence about corruption. That's not failure. That's more than I ever thought possible. Don't mistake survival for victory yet. We haven't won. We've just committed to a strategy that makes retreat impossible. Good. I'm tired of retreating. Lyra looked at him with an intensity that made something uncomfortable twist in Ronan's chest. You asked me once why I chose you. Why I threw myself at the Valacrest instead of seeking help elsewhere. Want to know the real reason? Ronan nodded. Because everyone else in this kingdom has spent years learning how to compromise, how to negotiate, how to accept corruption as the cost of stability. But you never learned that. You only learned how to hold positions until you won or died trying, and I needed someone who didn't know how to quit. She paused. I need that now more than ever, because in about 4 hours, royal guards are going to arrive with orders to take me. And I need to know you're not going to hand me over no matter what they threaten. I'm not handing you over. Ronan said it with the same certainty he'd used to give orders during the war. You're under Valicrest protection. That means something. It meant something 3 years ago when I held supply lines against impossible odds. It means something now. The specific threat changes, but the principle doesn't. You hold the line. You protect what's yours. And you don't compromise when compromise means betraying people who trusted you. Lyra's expression softened slightly. When did I become yours? The question caught Ronan off guard. He'd been thinking tactically, strategically, viewing her as responsibility and objective and mission parameter. But somewhere in the past 4 days, she'd stopped being just mission objective and become something else. Something he didn't have language for because the war had burned out his vocabulary for connection that wasn't tactical. I don't know, he admitted. Somewhere between the ballroom and burning the arrest warrant. Somewhere between teaching you how to defend yourself and realizing I'd rather burn the kingdom down than watch you destroyed by the same corruption that's been killing people for years. That's not tactical thinking. No. That's the problem. Ronan looked at her directly. I'm supposed to be making calculated decisions based on strategic advantage. Instead, I'm committing treason because the thought of you in a cell makes me want to set Parliament on fire. That's not command thinking. That's something else. Something I thought I'd lost in the North. What did you lose in the North? The ability to care about individual people more than objectives. The war teaches you to see soldiers as variables in equations, lives as acceptable losses if the position holds. You stop seeing people and start seeing tactical resources. It's how you survive making decisions that get people killed. Ronan was quiet for a moment, but you broke through that somehow. Made me care again. And I'm not sure if that makes me stronger or just more vulnerable. Maybe both, Lyra said. Maybe that's what makes you dangerous now. You're not just defending a position, you're defending something you actually care about. That changes the calculation. It changes everything, including the lengths I'm willing to go. Outside, dawn had fully broken over Ashenmere. The city was waking to newspapers filled with evidence that would either reform government or trigger civil war. And in approximately 4 hours, the Crown would send soldiers to arrest the woman standing in front of him. Ronan had defended worse positions, but he'd never defended anything that mattered this much. That realization was both terrifying and clarifying. Marin interrupted with the kind of urgent knock that meant crisis. Ronan opened the door to find her looking grim. Newspapers hit the streets 10 minutes ago. The city is erupting. Half the population is demanding Vexley's arrest. The other half is calling Duchess Lyra a revolutionary trying to overthrow legitimate government. There have been 3 riots already. Royal guards are mobilizing. And we just received word that Lord Vexley has requested military intervention to suppress what he's calling an attempted coup. So it's civil war. Ronan had been expecting this, but hearing it confirmed still hit like tactical defeat. How long before soldiers arrive? 3 hours. Maybe 4 if they have to organize properly. She paused. My lord, this is bigger than we planned. This isn't just protecting the Duchess. This is challenging the entire structure of parliamentary authority. People are going to die. The question is how many and whether it's worth the cost. Ronan looked at Lyra. She was the one who'd started this, who'd run through rain-soaked streets carrying documents that would either free the kingdom or burn it down. The decision was as much hers as his. She met his eyes. Her voice was clear, steady, certain. People have been dying for years while corruption thrived. Catherine died. My father died. 17 others that we know about and probably hundreds we don't. So the question isn't whether people will die. They're already dying. The question is whether they die meaninglessly while the system protects killers, or whether they die fighting for something that might actually change. Marin looked at Ronan. She's right. You know she's right. The system is broken beyond repair. Someone was always going to have to break it completely before rebuilding became possible. Apparently that someone is you. Apparently. Ronan moved to the window overlooking the courtyard where guards were running final defensive preparations. Get everyone not essential to defense out of the fortress. Servants, staff, anyone who doesn't want to be here when soldiers arrive. I won't trap people in a siege they didn't choose. Already done. Everyone who wanted to leave left 2 hours ago. The people here now are here because they chose to be. Good. Then we prepare for the worst and hope we survive to see whether it was worth it. Marin left. Ronan and Lyra stood in the study, surrounded by maps and tactical projections, and the growing certainty that they just committed to a confrontation that would either reshape Ashenmere or get them both killed trying. "What do we do until noon?" Lyra asked. "We make sure you're ready to address the public without breaking. That every word of your testimony is documented and verified. That even if they arrest you immediately after speaking, the evidence becomes too public to suppress." Ronan gestured toward the door. "And we make sure I'm ready to defend you when soldiers come, because they will come, and it's going to get violent." They spent the next 3 hours preparing. Lyra rehearsed her statement until she could deliver it under any condition. Ronan walked the fortress walls, checking defensive positions, and reminding guards that today they weren't defending territory. They were defending principle, and that made the stakes infinitely higher. By 11:30, journalists and independent witnesses had started arriving. Seraphine vetted each one personally before allowing entry. By noon, approximately 200 people crowded into Blackthorne Keep's outer courtyard. Reporters, citizens, lords who'd broken with Vexley. Even a few parliamentary ministers who'd apparently decided corruption was less tolerable than they'd previously believed. Ronan stood on the fortress battlements looking down at the crowd. Behind him, Lyra waited to speak. Ahead, somewhere in the city, soldiers were mobilizing with orders to arrest her. This was it. The moment when everything either worked or fell apart completely. He turned to Lyra. "Ready?" She nodded. "More ready than I've ever been." "Then show them what you came here to show them. Make them understand why this matters. And don't let fear show even if you're terrified, because fear is what they'll use to dismiss everything you say." "I'm not afraid anymore." Lyra's voice was certain. "I've spent 6 years being afraid. Today I'm angry. And anger is more useful." She stepped forward to address the crowd. The courtyard went silent. Lyra Valcress, Duchess of Blackthorne, began speaking. Her voice carried across the space with the clarity of someone who'd practiced this moment for years. "4 days ago, I fled into the night carrying evidence of murder, corruption, and smuggling networks operating at the highest levels of government. I sought protection not because I was guilty, but because I knew that presenting truth to a system designed to suppress it would get me killed." She paused. "Lord Cassian Vexley has spent years building a criminal empire protected by parliamentary immunity and political connections. He murdered my father 6 years ago for investigating his operations. He murdered Catherine Ashford 2 days ago for discovering documents exposing his crimes. And yesterday he burned a warehouse containing evidence that would prove his guilt, because destroying proof is easier than facing justice." The crowd was listening with absolute attention. Reporters were taking notes. Lyra continued, "I stand before you today not as a criminal, but as someone demanding accountability from a system that has forgotten what accountability means. The evidence I possess documents smuggling operations through 6 port cities, murder of at least 17 people, bribery of customs officials and parliamentary members, and coordination between multiple lords to divide territory and profits while using government resources to protect their operations." She held up the documents. Physical proof, visible to everyone. Yesterday, Lord Vexley responded to this evidence not by defending himself in court, but by requesting my arrest on fabricated charges, by burning records that would verify my claims, by mobilizing parliamentary allies to paint me as unstable and my testimony as trauma response. And as of this morning, the Crown issued a warrant for my arrest on charges of theft and conspiracy to incite civil unrest. The crowd murmured, angry, shocked, exactly the response they needed. Lyra's voice hardened. "I am guilty of theft. I stole documents from a criminal enterprise, but I am not guilty of lying. I am not guilty of fabricating evidence. And I am not guilty of conspiracy to incite unrest. What I am guilty of is demanding that powerful people face the same consequences as everyone else. And apparently in Ashenmere, that demand is considered revolutionary." She gestured to the witnesses beside her. "These people are here to testify about the warehouse fire, about seeing authorization papers signed by Lord Vexley, about watching men carry lamp oil into a building that burned 6 hours later. Their testimony corroborates my evidence, and yet the Crown's response is to arrest me rather than investigate the man who ordered arson to destroy proof of his crimes." The crowd was getting louder, angrier, energy building towards something that felt like momentum. Ronan watched from the battlements. This was working. The narrative was shifting from criminal servant to whistleblower facing retaliation, from theft to accountability, from conspiracy to demand for justice. But working or not, soldiers were still coming. Lyra finished her statement with perfect timing. "I will not run. I will not hide. I will not withdraw my testimony or apologize for demanding accountability. If the Crown wants to arrest me for presenting evidence of corruption, then they can do so in front of all of you, in front of journalists, in front of history. And you can decide for yourselves whether justice is being served or whether power is simply protecting power while calling it law. The crowd erupted, cheering, shouting, not unanimous but loud enough to matter. Then trumpets sounded from the fortress gates. Royal guards had arrived. Ronan descended from the battlements with the efficiency of someone moving toward combat. He reached Lyra's side as the gates opened to reveal 50 soldiers in crown livery, led by a captain whose face suggested he really didn't want to be here. The captain rode forward. His voice was formal, official. By order of the Crown and recommendation of Parliament, I am here to execute an arrest warrant for Lyra Valcrest, Duchess of Blackthorne, on charges of theft, defamation, and conspiracy to incite civil unrest. Surrender the accused immediately. Ronan stepped forward, positioned himself between the soldiers and Lyra. His voice was quiet, but carried across the courtyard with absolute clarity. No. The single word hung in the air like a declaration of war. The captain looked uncomfortable. Duke Ronan, I have orders directly from the Crown. This is not negotiable. Surrender the Duchess, or you will be arrested for obstruction and harboring a fugitive. I said no. Ronan didn't raise his voice, didn't move, just stood there with the kind of presence that made 50 armed soldiers suddenly question whether following orders was survivable. My wife is under Valcrest protection. She has presented evidence of murder and corruption that Parliament refuses to investigate. Your warrant is a tool to silence testimony, not enforce justice. So I'm giving you one opportunity to withdraw and report that the Duchess is unavailable for arrest. Then you can explain to whoever sent you that attempting to execute this warrant will require going through me first. The captain's hand moved toward his sword. That's sedition. That's treason. I have authority to arrest you both by force if necessary. Then try. Ronan's voice went cold. Bring your 50 soldiers. Bring 500 if you think it'll help. But understand clearly what happens next. I've defended fortresses against armies. I've held positions everyone said were impossible. And I've never lost a defensive engagement when the position mattered. You want to arrest my wife? You're welcome to try. But it's going to cost you more soldiers than you're willing to sacrifice. And when survivors report back to whoever sent you, they're going to explain exactly why forcing this confrontation was catastrophically expensive. The courtyard had gone absolutely silent. 200 witnesses watching a duke defy the Crown directly. Reporters taking notes that would define this moment in history one way or another. The captain looked at his soldiers, looked at the fortress walls bristling with defensive positions, looked at Ronan standing there like a man who'd rather die than retreat. Made a decision. We're withdrawing to report. But this isn't over. The Crown will respond with force. I'm counting on it. Ronan's smile was not comforting. Tell them Duke Ronan Valcrest defied the arrest warrant. Tell them Blackthorne Keep is under siege conditions. And tell them that if they want Duchess Lyra, they'll have to kill me first because I'm not handing over someone who's telling the truth just because powerful people find truth inconvenient. The captain turned his horse, signaled his soldiers to withdraw. They rode out through the gates, leaving nothing behind except the certainty that this confrontation had just escalated beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. The gates closed. The crowd in the courtyard erupted in noise, some cheering, some horrified, all witnessing history happening in real time. Ronan turned to Lyra. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't parse. Shock, maybe. Or recognition. Or something else entirely. You just defied the Crown for me. I defied corruption using Crown authority to suppress testimony. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, you just committed treason, made yourself a target, chose me over every alliance and protection you've spent years building. Yes. Ronan looked at her directly. I did. Because somewhere in the past 4 days, you stopped being a tactical objective and became something I'd rather burn the kingdom for than surrender. I don't know when that happened. I don't know how. But it did. And apparently I'm willing to commit sedition about it. Lyra laughed. It was half shock and half something that sounded like relief. You're terrible at romantic declarations. This isn't romance. This is tactical honesty. Romance is what people do when they have time for feelings and complications. This is war. And in war, you protect what matters, even when protecting it costs everything else. Behind them, Seraphine was already coordinating next moves. Getting reporters out before the inevitable military response, documenting testimony, preparing legal arguments about unlawful orders and crown overreach. Marin approached with information that looked grim. My lord, we're receiving reports from the city. Vexley has convinced 6 parliamentary lords to formally request that you be stripped of your title and arrested for sedition. They're calling this an attempted coup. An attack on legitimate government. Good. Let them make it formal. Ronan turned to face his assembled household, everyone who'd chosen to stay during siege. Every guard who'd decided defending principle was worth risking execution. Listen carefully. What happened today was not tactical error. It was necessity. The Crown sent soldiers to arrest someone presenting evidence of corruption. I refused because surrendering her means surrendering any hope that this kingdom values justice over power. So now we're at war. Not with the kingdom, with the corruption that's been running it. And that war is going to get worse before it gets better. He paused. Let me be clear about what that means. Soldiers will return, probably in greater numbers. They'll attempt to breach these walls and arrest both me and the Duchess. Some of us will probably die defending this position. So if anyone wants to leave, now is the time. I won't hold it against you. But if you stay knowing that we're fighting for something that might not succeed, and definitely will cost more than any of us want to pay. No one moved. Not one person. Ronan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Loyalty was expensive. These people were offering it, knowing the cost might be their lives. Then we prepare for siege. Maximum defensive positions, ration supplies, and complete lockdown until either they withdraw or we force a resolution. He looked at Lyra. And you start preparing testimony for every journalist we can reach. Because even if they arrest us, the evidence needs to survive. The day dissolved into preparation. Guards positioning defensive equipment. Lyra working with Seraphine to document everything. Ronan walking the battlements, calculating angles of attack and vulnerability points like he was back in the north, defending supply lines against impossible odds. By evening, the first reports arrived. Parliament had formally declared Ronan in violation of Crown authority. 6 lords were demanding military intervention. And Vexley himself had released a statement calling the Duchess a dangerous radical who'd manipulated a traumatized war hero into sedition. The narrative war was in full force, but so was the actual war. By midnight, scouts reported that Crown forces were mobilizing, not 50 soldiers this time, 300, with siege equipment and orders to breach Blackthorne Keep by any means necessary. Ronan received the intelligence without surprise. This was always where it was heading. From the moment Lyra threw herself into his carriage, this confrontation had been inevitable. The question was never whether it would happen, only when. And whether they'd survive it. He found Lyra in the library again. She was writing letters. Testament, probably. The kind of documentation people created when survival stopped being certain. How long do we have? She asked without looking up. 12 hours. Maybe less if they decide to attack at dawn. Ronan sat across from her. 300 soldiers with siege equipment against a fortress designed to withstand exactly that kind of assault. We can hold for weeks if necessary. The question is whether holding accomplishes anything or just delays inevitable defeat. What do you want to do? I want to force them to choose between withdrawing or committing to a siege so expensive it becomes a public relations disaster. I want to make this so visible that every casualty becomes evidence that the Crown cares more about protecting corruption than serving justice. He paused. But wanting that and achieving it are different things. The Crown has resources, time, legitimacy. We have a fortress and principle. That's not usually enough. Lyra finally looked up. Do you regret it, choosing this fight? No. Ronan was surprised by how easily the answer came. I've spent 3 years feeling like survival was the only objective that mattered. Like getting through each day without collapsing under the weight of all the decisions that got people killed was victory enough. But the past 4 days reminded me that some things are worth more than survival. Worth fighting for even when fighting costs everything. Like what? Like you. Like justice. Like the possibility that maybe this kingdom could be something better than corruption dressed up as civilization. Ronan stood and moved to the window. They turned down all external lights to make targeting harder. The darkness outside was absolute. I don't know if we'll win, but I know I'd rather die trying than spend another 3 years pretending survival without purpose is enough. Lyra joined him at the window. Her voice was quiet. Thank you. For believing me. For protecting me. for being willing to burn everything rather than surrender me to people who'd make me disappear. Don't thank me yet. We still have to survive the next 12 hours. Even if we don't, even if this ends badly, you gave me something no one else would. The chance to fight back. The chance to make my father's death and Catherine's murder mean something. That's worth more than survival. They stood together in the darkness, watching the city below. Somewhere out there, 300 soldiers were preparing to attack. Somewhere, lords were coordinating political strategy to paint this as rebellion rather than accountability. And somewhere, the newspapers Lyra had worked 6 years to create were spreading across Ashenmere carrying evidence that would either change everything or get buried along with everyone who'd tried to expose it. Ronan reached out and took her hand. Not romantic, not calculated. Just human contact between two people about to face violence, neither was certain they'd survive. Lyra squeezed back, understanding without words. Then dawn began breaking over the horizon, and with it came the sound of marching soldiers and siege equipment moving into position around Blackthorne Keep. The war had arrived at their gates, and Ronan stood on the battlements beside his wife, watching 300 soldiers arrange themselves for assault, and felt something he hadn't felt since the northern campaigns. Not fear exactly. More like clarity. The kind that came when all the strategic calculation and tactical planning finally simplified into one basic reality. You held the line or you died trying, and either way, at least you'd chosen something worth defending. Below, the commander of Crown forces called out terms of surrender. Above, Ronan prepared to refuse them. And between those two positions lay the final confrontation that would either break the corruption strangling Ashenmere or break everyone foolish enough to challenge it. The choice had already been made. Now came the consequences. The Crown commander was a man named Gerard Thornwise, who'd built his career on following orders without questioning whether those orders served justice or power. He sat on his horse 50 yards from Blackthorne Keep's gates, wearing armor that gleamed in the dawn light, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. His voice carried across the distance with formal precision. Duke Ronan Valacres, by order of the Crown and authority of Parliament, you are commanded to surrender yourself and Duchess Lyra Valacres immediately. Failure to comply will result in forcible breach of your fortress and arrest of all occupants for sedition, treason, and armed rebellion against legitimate Crown authority. Ronan stood on the battlements looking down at 300 soldiers arranged in siege formation. Behind him, Lyra waited in silence. Below, his guards held defensive positions with the kind of readiness that came from training under someone who'd survived 2 years of northern warfare. The air smelled like tension and the particular kind of fear that arrived when violence became inevitable. He'd been here before. Different battlefield. Same calculation. Hold the position or die trying. The mathematics hadn't changed. Only what the position meant. Commander Thornwise, Ronan called back. His voice was calm, almost conversational. I appreciate the formality of your warning, but I'm going to decline your offer. My wife is not surrendering to face charges designed to silence testimony about corruption. I'm not surrendering to face punishment for refusing to enable that silencing. And this fortress is not opening its gates to soldiers enforcing orders that serve criminals rather than justice. The commander's face tightened. That's your final answer? That's reality. You're welcome to attempt breach, but understand what that requires. Ronan gestured to the fortress walls. Blackthorne Keep was built to withstand siege by armies larger than yours, with equipment better than yours for purposes more legitimate than yours. I've defended worse positions with fewer resources. So your options are withdraw and report that enforcing this warrant is militarily impossible, or commit to an assault that will cost you more soldiers than you're willing to sacrifice. Choose carefully. Thornwise looked at the fortress, looked at his soldiers, made the calculation every commander made when facing prepared defensive positions. Was the objective worth the casualties? Apparently the Crown thought it was. Breach the gates, Thornwise ordered. Prepare siege equipment. The soldiers moved with professional efficiency. Battering ram forward. Archers positioning for covering fire. Siege ladders assembling. The choreography of violence performed by people trained to execute orders, regardless of whether those orders made moral sense. Ronan watched them organize and felt the familiar detachment settle over him. The place where emotions stopped interfering with tactical necessity, where fear and doubt compressed into simple equations about angles and timing and acceptable losses. He'd lived in that place for 2 years in the north, had thought he'd never return there. Apparently he'd been wrong. Hold fire until they commit to the assault, he called to his guards. Let them get close enough that retreat costs as much as advance. Then make every shot count. The battering ram reached the gates. 20 soldiers working in coordinated rhythm. The first impact shook the fortress down to its foundations. The second cracked timber. The third started splintering the reinforced oak that had held against attacks for 2 centuries. Ronan's archers opened fire. Not wildly, not in panic. Controlled volleys targeting the soldiers operating the ram. 3 men fell. 5. 8. But more soldiers moved forward to replace them, and the ram kept hammering. The gates were going to fail. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 20. But they were going to fail, and when they did, 300 soldiers would pour into the courtyard and the real fighting would begin. Ronan had always known it would come to this, had planned for it, prepared defensive positions inside the fortress for exactly this scenario. Fall back through predetermined choke points. Make them pay for every corridor. Turn the keep's interior into a maze where numbers became disadvantage instead of strength. But knowing the plan and executing it while watching people die were different experiences. The gates shattered. The ram punched through in an explosion of splinters and iron. Soldiers poured through the breach with the momentum of attackers who believed numbers guaranteed victory. They learned differently in the first 30 seconds. The courtyard was a kill zone. Ronan's guards had positioned themselves in elevated positions with overlapping fields of fire. The soldiers who rushed through the gates found themselves trapped in a space designed specifically to punish that kind of aggressive entry. Arrows came from 3 directions. Rocks dropped from battlements. Burning oil poured from murder holes that turned sections of courtyard into infernos. The assault stalled. Soldiers retreated, regrouped, tried again with shields raised and better tactical awareness. Ronan watched from above with the cold assessment of someone cataloging how long defensive positions would hold. The courtyard would buy them maybe an hour. The outer corridors another 2. After that, fighting would compress into the keep's interior where every room became potential last stand. Beside him, Lyra was silent, watching violence unfold with an expression that suggested she was seeing exactly what choosing this confrontation actually meant. People were dying down there, not abstractions, not variables in tactical equations. Actual people bleeding out on stone because she demanded accountability, and Ronan had decided that demand was worth defending. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Don't be." Ronan didn't look away from the battle below. This was always where it was going. The moment you walked into that ballroom with evidence, this confrontation became inevitable. We just chose to fight it here instead of somewhere less defensible. People are dying because of us. People have been dying for years because of Vexley and lords like him. Today they're dying because someone finally decided to do something about it. He glanced at her. That's not your fault. That's what happens when corruption gets protected long enough that dismantling it requires violence. Below, Crown forces had breached the courtyard and were pressing toward the keep's interior. Ronan's guards were falling back through predetermined positions, fighting, retreating, making every corridor cost soldiers before yielding it. The defensive strategy was working, but working wasn't the same as winning. They were buying time. The question was what that time purchased. The answer arrived in a form nobody expected. A rider approached Crown lines carrying white flag and wearing colors that marked him as royal messenger. He dismounted, spoke urgently to Commander Thornwise. Whatever he said made Thornwise's face go through several expressions before settling on something between relief and confusion. "Cease assault!" Thornwise shouted. "All forces hold position." The fighting stuttered to a stop. Soldiers who'd been advancing halted mid-attack. Guards who'd been defending held arrows ready, but didn't fire. The sudden silence was more unsettling than combat had been. Thornwise rode forward alone, stopped just inside the shattered gates. His voice carried clearly through the courtyard. "Duke Ronan, I've just received orders directly from the Crown. The assault is suspended pending emergency parliamentary session. You and Duchess Lyra are commanded to appear before Parliament within 2 hours to address charges and present evidence under formal investigation protocols." It was a trap. Had to be. They'd get to Parliament and be arrested immediately away from defensive positions. Ronan called back. "What guarantees do we have that this isn't simply strategy to separate us from our defenses?" Thornwise held up a sealed document. "Royal guarantee of safe passage signed by the Crown personally. You have immunity from arrest until parliamentary session concludes. After that, whatever Parliament decides becomes law." Why the sudden change? What happened? Thornwise hesitated, then answered with the kind of honesty that suggested he was as confused as everyone else. Lord Vexley attempted to flee the kingdom 3 hours ago. He was intercepted at the port by Crown investigators who'd apparently been conducting independent inquiry into the warehouse fire. They found additional evidence on his person, documentation that corroborates Duchess Lyra's accusations. The parliamentary lords who'd been defending him are now demanding emergency session to determine if they've been protecting a criminal. The courtyard erupted in noise, shouting, confusion. The fundamental reality of the situation had just inverted completely. Ronan looked at Lyra. She was staring at Thornwise like she couldn't process what she'd just heard. 6 years of planning, 4 days of running, hours of siege. And Vexley had broken in the final moment by trying to run instead of fighting. Could be legitimate, Seraphine said from behind them. She'd appeared on the battlements without announcement, or could be trap designed to get you both into Parliament where they can arrest you more cleanly. But if it's legitimate, then we just won without having to burn the fortress down around us. Ronan considered the options. Trust royal guarantee and wrist trap, or refuse and continue fighting until either the fortress fell or Crown forces withdrew. Neither option was safe. Both carried catastrophic risk. But continuing to fight meant more casualties defending a position they might not need to defend if Vexley's collapse was real. He made the decision the same way he'd made every command decision in the North. Calculate the objective. Assess the risk. Choose the path most likely to accomplish the mission, even if it meant accepting vulnerability. "We accept," Ronan called down, "under condition that all forces withdraw from the fortress immediately and that royal guarantee extends to everyone in Blackthorne Keep. No arrests, no retaliation. Complete immunity until Parliament concludes." Agreed. Thornwise signaled his forces. All units withdraw to staging positions. The siege is suspended. The soldiers pulled back, slowly, suspiciously. But they pulled back. Within 20 minutes, the courtyard was empty except for bodies and debris from fighting that had accomplished exactly nothing except proving both sides were willing to die over this. Ronan descended from the battlements with Lyra beside him. His guards had taken casualties. 7 dead, 14 wounded. The courtyard looked like battlefield aftermath with blood turning black on stone and smoke rising from fires that were still burning. He'd seen worse in the north. That didn't make it easier. "Get the wounded to the physician," he ordered Marin. "Document all casualties, and prepare formal protest about Crown forces assaulting a fortress to enforce unlawful arrest warrant. Even if this resolves peacefully, I want record of what they attempted." Marin nodded and moved to coordinate. Ronan turned to Lyra. "Are you ready for this? Walking into Parliament with nothing but royal guarantee protecting us? No." Lyra looked at the casualties, at the bodies being moved with careful respect. "But I'm going anyway because this is what we fought for. The chance to present evidence where it can't be suppressed. The chance to make them listen. Then we go. But we go armed, and we go with witnesses. I'm not trusting parliamentary good faith without insurance." They prepared quickly. Ronan in formal attire that was also defensive. Lyra in the kind of dress that announced status, while hiding the fact that she was carrying 2 knives and knew how to use them. Seraphine and the legal team assembled documentation that would either condemn Vexley or condemn them for fabricating evidence. The carriage ride to Parliament felt longer than siege had felt. Every street corner was potential ambush. Every crowd was potential attack. But they reached Parliament without incident and found the building surrounded by people. Thousands of them. Citizens who'd read the newspapers, who'd heard about the siege, who'd apparently decided that watching their government decide whether to prosecute corruption or prosecute whistleblowers was worth standing in cold dawn air for hours. The crowd parted to let them through. Some were cheering. Some were silent. All were watching with the intensity of people witnessing history happening in real time. The parliamentary hall was packed beyond capacity. Every seat filled. Standing room overflowing. Lords and ministers who normally couldn't be bothered to attend routine sessions had suddenly discovered urgent need to be present. Lord Vexley sat in the accused section surrounded by guards. He looked smaller somehow. Diminished. The confidence he'd worn 4 days ago had been replaced by something that looked like panic poorly disguised as indignation. Across from him sat Gerald Ashford and 5 other lords who'd been defending Vexley's innocence. They looked like people who'd just realized they'd been protecting a criminal and were trying to calculate how much that association would cost them. The Lord Speaker called the session to order. The emergency session of Parliament is convened to address evidence of criminal conspiracy, murder, and corruption involving Lord Cassian Vexley and potentially other parliamentary members. We will hear testimony from all relevant parties and examine all available evidence before determining appropriate action. He gestured to Vexley. Lord Cassian, you stand accused of multiple crimes including murder, smuggling, bribery, arson, and destruction of evidence. How do you respond? Vexley stood. His voice was steady, but his hands shook. I categorically deny all accusations. The so-called evidence against me was fabricated by a disgruntled former servant with clear motivation to create false accusations. The warehouse fire was accident. My attempted departure from Ashenmere was legitimate business travel that was mischaracterized as flight. And I resent the implication that I would be party to criminal activity when my entire career has been dedicated to public service. It was a good performance. Confident, indignant, exactly what someone falsely accused would say. The problem was the evidence sitting on the speaker's desk that contradicted every word. The speaker held up documents. Lord Vexley, Crown investigators found these papers on your person when you were intercepted at the port. They appear to be additional smuggling ledgers and correspondence with known criminal organizations. Can you explain why you were carrying this material if you claim innocence? Vexley's face went pale. Those documents are clearly planted. I've never seen them before. They were found in a locked case that you were personally carrying. Multiple witnesses confirm you refused to relinquish that case until physically restrained. I was protecting legitimate business documents from theft. Someone must have added criminal materials to compromise me. The speaker looked tired. Lord Vexley, we also have testimony from your personal secretary who admits under oath that you ordered the warehouse fire. We have bank records showing payments to the men who committed arson. We have correspondence between you and the other accused lords discussing division of smuggling profits. And we have the original testimony from Duchess Lyra supported by independent witnesses. At what point do you stop claiming conspiracy and start accepting that the evidence is comprehensive and damning? The chamber was silent. Vexley stood there looking like a man watching his entire world collapse. Then he did something unexpected. He broke, not dramatically, not with grand confession, just quietly sat down and stopped defending himself because defense had become impossible. Gerald Ashford stood. His voice was careful. Mr. Speaker, I move that we accept the evidence as legitimate and proceed with formal prosecution of Lord Vexley and any other parties shown to be complicit. I also move that we issue formal apology to Duchess Lyra for questioning her testimony and to Duke Ronan for attempting to enforce an unjust arrest warrant. The reversal was complete. Ashford had gone from defending Vexley to condemning him in less than a day because defending corruption had become politically untenable. The speaker nodded. Motion accepted. Lord Cassian Vexley, you are hereby stripped of parliamentary immunity and remanded to Crown custody pending trial on multiple criminal charges. Additional investigations will be conducted into all parties shown to be connected to your operations. Guards moved forward. Vexley didn't resist, just stood and allowed himself to be escorted from the chamber, like he'd already accepted that fighting was pointless. 6 years of planning, 4 days of running, hours of siege, and it ended with Vexley being led away in chains while Parliament scrambled to distance themselves from someone they'd been protecting days earlier. The speaker turned to Ronan and Lyra. Duke Ronan, Duchess Lyra. Parliament extends formal apology for the manner in which these accusations were initially handled. Your courage in presenting evidence despite personal danger serves the kingdom well. All charges against you are dismissed and all arrest warrants voided. It should have felt like victory, like vindication. Instead, it just felt like exhaustion settling into bones that had been holding tension for too long. Ronan stood. His voice carried clearly through the chamber. Parliament's apology is noted, but apologies don't resurrect murdered victims. They don't restore my father's life or Catherine Ashford's life or the lives of 17 other people killed to protect smuggling profits. He paused. What Parliament can do is reform the systems that allowed this corruption to thrive for years. Reform immunity protections. Reform investigation protocols. Reform accountability structures so that the next person presenting evidence doesn't have to flee for their life and marry a stranger to survive testifying. The chamber murmured. Some agreement, some discomfort. Ronan didn't care. He'd said what needed saying. The session dissolved into procedural discussions about investigations and reforms, and all the bureaucratic machinery that would either actually change things or simply perform change while preserving power structures. Ronan and Lyra left Parliament together, walking out through corridors that felt different now, less hostile, more like spaces where justice had accidentally happened despite systems designed to prevent it. The crowd outside erupted when they appeared, cheering, shouting, treating them like heroes when really they'd just been two people desperate enough and stubborn enough to refuse surrender. The carriage ride back to Blackthorne Keep was silent, both of them processing what had just happened, that they'd survived, that Vexley had fallen, that 6 years of planning had actually worked even if the path to success had been more violent and costly than either had imagined. They reached the fortress as evening settled over Ashen Mere. The gates were being repaired, the courtyard cleaned of battle debris, life resuming with the resilience that came from surviving things that should have destroyed you. Ronan found Merrin in his study reviewing casualty reports and reconstruction plans. She looked up when he entered. Is it over? For now. Vexley's arrested. Parliamentary investigation ongoing. Warrants dismissed. He sat heavily in his chair. 7 people died defending this fortress. Another 14 wounded. That's the cost of today's victory. They knew what they were defending. Merrin's voice was gentle, and they chose to defend it anyway because some things matter more than survival. You taught them that. I taught them violence, how to hold positions, how to kill efficiently. That's not the same as teaching them meaning. You taught them that holding positions matters when the position is worth defending. That's meaning. She paused. What happens now? Now? Ronan looked at the map still spread across his desk. Now we figure out how to exist when the immediate threat is gone, and we're still married to a stranger who's technically my wife, but was really a tactical alliance that outlived its original purpose. Have you talked to her about that? No. Because talking about it requires admitting that somewhere in the past 4 days, she stopped being tactical alliance and became something else. Something I don't have language for because the war burned out my vocabulary for connection that isn't military. Maybe you should find that language. Merrin stood to leave. She just watched you commit treason rather than surrender her. I don't think tactical alliance adequately describes what that means. She left him alone with maps and casualty reports and the uncomfortable realization that his careful emotional distance had been completely dismantled by someone who'd walked into his life carrying documents and demanding war. He found Lyra in the library. Again. She seemed to gravitate there when processing things. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression suggested she'd been thinking similar thoughts. We're still married, she said without preamble. Yes. The contract says we can dissolve the marriage by mutual agreement once the threat is neutralized. Vexley's arrested. The threat is neutralized. She paused. So we should probably discuss terms. Probably. Ronan sat across from her. What do you want? Lyra was quiet for a long time. Then she said something he wasn't expecting. I don't know. 6 years I wanted revenge, wanted justice, wanted Vexley destroyed and my father's death meaning something. And now I have that. He's arrested. The evidence is public. Parliamentary investigation is forcing reforms. I accomplished everything I planned. She looked at him directly. But I didn't plan for what comes after accomplishing it. Didn't plan for the fact that the person who protected me would become someone I actually care about, instead of just tactical resource. Didn't plan for marriage of convenience becoming something that feels less convenient and more real. Ronan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. That's not tactical thinking. No, it's the opposite of tactical thinking. It's admitting that somewhere between siege and Parliament, I stopped seeing you as the butcher who could protect me and started seeing you as the person who committed treason rather than surrender me. And I don't know what to do with that because caring about people makes you vulnerable, and vulnerable is how people die. I know. Ronan had lived that truth for 3 years, but apparently caring anyway is what makes us human instead of just survival machines. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, more like both of them trying to find words for experiences they didn't have language for. Finally, Ronan spoke. For 3 years, I've been existing rather than living, going through motions, holding positions, surviving one day at a time without any sense of purpose beyond not dying. He met her eyes. The past 4 days reminded me what it feels like to fight for something that actually matters, to care about outcomes beyond simple survival. You did that. By walking into my life and demanding protection and refusing to break even when breaking would have been easier. So no, I don't know what happens next, But I know I'm not ready for you to leave just because the tactical necessity that brought you here is resolved." Lyra smiled. It was small, tired, real. "I'm not ready to leave either, which is terrifying because I spent 6 years training myself not to need anyone, not to trust anyone, to operate completely alone because alone was safer. And now I'm sitting here admitting that being married to you feels less like contract and more like something I actually want. Then maybe we stop calling it contract. Stop treating it like tactical arrangement and figure out what it looks like when two people who don't know how to need anyone decide to try anyway. That sounds complicated." "It is. But apparently I'm willing to commit treason for you. Complicated is comparatively manageable." Lyra laughed. "That's terrible romantic logic. This isn't romance. This is tactical honesty that happens to involve feelings I'm not good at acknowledging." Ronan stood and held out his hand. "Stay. Not because you need protection, not because we signed contracts, but because somewhere in all the violence and political warfare, we built something that feels worth keeping. And I'd like to see what that becomes when it's not defined by external threat." Lyra took his hand. Her grip was firm. "Certain. Okay. We stay married. We figure out how to exist together when existence isn't constant crisis. And we deal with whatever complications arise because apparently we're both capable of surviving worse than domestic adjustment. Apparently. The weeks that followed were stranger than war had been. Vexley's trial dominated public attention for months. Parliamentary investigations exposed corruption networks that ran deeper than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Reforms were passed, some meaningful, some performative. The kingdom shifted slowly towards something that looked more like justice, even if justice remained aspirational rather than guaranteed. Ronan and Lyra learned how to be married without tactical necessity driving every interaction. It was awkward, uncomfortable. Neither of them knew how to do domestic normalcy after years of operating in crisis mode. But they learned, slowly, with the same stubborn determination they'd used to survive siege. Lyra established legal advocacy programs for people without power facing aristocratic abuse, used her position as Duchess to force accountability in cases that would have been buried under previous systems, became exactly what she'd wanted to be, voice for people who'd been silenced. Ronan rebuilt Blackthorne Keep into something that felt less like fortress and more like home. Worked with parliamentary reformers to restructure military protocols around accountability instead of just efficiency. Found purpose beyond holding positions until someone killed him. They fought. Often. About strategy and priorities and how to navigate aristocratic society when neither of them had patience for aristocratic games. But they fought together instead of alone, and that made difference feel survivable. 6 months after Vexley's arrest, they stood on Blackthorne Keep's battlements, watching sunset paint the northern cliffs in colors that looked like fire and endings and new beginnings all mixed together. "Do you ever regret it?" Lyra asked. "Choosing me over everything else?" "No." Ronan's answer came easily now. "I regret the casualties, the people who died defending principles instead of surviving quietly. But I don't regret defending you. Don't regret choosing to fight corruption instead of enabling it through silence. Don't regret learning that caring about something beyond survival is what makes survival worth having." That's unexpectedly philosophical for someone who spent years treating existence as tactical problem. Maybe I'm learning that tactics aren't enough, that holding positions matters less than understanding why positions are worth holding. He looked at her. "You taught me that. By refusing to accept survival without meaning. By demanding that power be used for something beyond maintaining power." Lyra leaned against him. It was casual now, natural, not calculated. "I spent 6 years planning revenge, building evidence, training myself to sacrifice everything for justice. And then I got justice and discovered the person I'd married for protection had become someone I actually wanted to build life with. That wasn't part of the plan. Plans change. Objectives shift. What matters is adapting while keeping sight of what actually matters. And what matters? This. You. The possibility that maybe we can be something other than damage pretending to be functional." Ronan put his arm around her shoulders. It was still awkward. He still didn't have language for tenderness that wasn't tactical, but he was learning, and learning was victory of its own kind. Below them, Ashenmere was settling into evening. The city looked peaceful, deceptively so. Corruption hadn't been eliminated, just challenged, pushed back, made slightly less comfortable than it had been. Progress was slow and incomplete and frustratingly insufficient, but it was progress, And sometimes progress was what you got instead of perfection. Sometimes surviving and building and choosing meaning over comfort was victory enough. Sometimes the people you protected for tactical reasons became the people you'd burn kingdoms for because somewhere between crisis and resolution, they'd become essential. Ronan had spent 3 years believing survival was the only objective that mattered, that getting through each day without collapsing under weight of all the violence he'd survived and caused was victory sufficient. Lyra had taught him differently, had shown him that survival without purpose was just slow death disguised as living, that caring about outcomes and people and principles beyond simple existence was what separated humans from machines executing survival programming. He'd committed treason learning that lesson, had defied crown authority and faced siege and risked execution for someone who'd started as stranger and become something he didn't have vocabulary for because love was a word the war had beaten out of him, but the reality of it had apparently survived anyway. The sun finished setting. Darkness settled over Ashenmere. And on the battlements of Blackthorne Keep, two people who'd built marriage from desperation and contract stood together watching their kingdom struggle toward something better than it had been. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was theirs. And after everything they'd survived to build it, that was victory enough. Years later, when historians wrote about the reforms that reshaped Ashenmere's government, they traced the catalyst back to one pivotal moment. Not the parliamentary sessions, not the legal reforms, but the night a desperate woman threw herself into a duke's carriage and demanded protection. That became war, that became revolution, that became foundation for actual accountability. They called it the Blackthorne Uprising, the moment when corruption faced someone stubborn enough and protected by someone brutal enough that the entire system had to choose between reform or civil war. What the historians missed was the human story underneath the political narrative, the way survival transformed into purpose, the way tactical alliance became genuine connection, the way two people broken by violence and loss learned to build something worth protecting instead of just surviving quietly until death arrived. Ronan and Lyra never corrected the historical record. They were too busy living to worry about how history remembered them. Too focused on building reforms and fighting corruption and learning how to be married without crisis driving every decision. But sometimes on quiet evenings, they'd stand on the battlements where they'd first defied crown authority together and remember the moment when everything changed. When survival stopped being enough and meaning became the objective that mattered. And in those moments, watching sunset paint the cliffs in colors that looked like fire and promise and hard-won peace, they'd hold hands and acknowledge silently that some victories were worth any cost. Some positions were worth defending even when defense meant risking everything. Some people were worth committing treason for. And some loves were built not from romance or convenience, but from choosing repeatedly to fight for each other when fighting was harder than surrendering. From learning that caring despite vulnerability was strength rather than weakness. From discovering that the opposite of loneliness wasn't just company, but genuine partnership with someone who understood exactly what survival cost and chose connection anyway. The kingdom changed slowly. Corruption diminished gradually. Justice remained imperfect but improved incrementally. And at the center of that slow transformation stood Blackthorne Keep, no longer fortress holding against siege, but foundation for something better. Home to the Duke who'd learned that power meant nothing without purpose, and the Duchess who'd taught him that truth by refusing to accept survival without meaning. They'd built it together from desperation and violence, and the stubborn refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier. Built it into something that mattered, something worth the cost. And as Ronan stood beside Lyra, watching their kingdom struggle toward better futures, he finally understood what he'd been missing during 3 years of empty survival after the war. Victory wasn't about holding positions until you died. Victory was about finding positions worth holding, people worth protecting, principles worth fighting for even when fighting cost everything. He'd found all three in the woman beside him, the stranger who'd crashed into his life demanding war and stayed to build peace, the tactical alliance who'd become genuine love even if he was still learning how to admit that without military metaphors. She'd saved him by letting him save her, taught him meaning by demanding it for herself, shown him that the opposite of battlefield numbness wasn't civilian peace, but purposeful engagement with world worth caring about. That was worth treason, worth siege, worth every uncomfortable step toward connection with another human being, worth building life around instead of just surviving through. And as darkness settled completely over Ashenmere and stars emerged one by one above the northern cliffs, Ronan Valcrest, Duke of Blackthorne, formerly the butcher of the northern campaigns, stood beside his wife and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just survival, not just tactical success, but actual peace earned through choosing meaning over comfort, through fighting for principles instead of just defending territory. Through learning that caring about someone despite vulnerability was the most tactical decision he'd ever made, because it was the one that made survival worth having. The war had taught him how to hold positions. Lyra had taught him why positions were worth holding. Together they'd built something from that knowledge, something imperfect and complicated and worth every cost they'd paid to create it, and that was victory enough.